Chapter 13. "Captain Danbury, assist me this instant." Reverend young Somers stood leaning against the barricade, his chest heaving with the exertion of walking up the sloping corridor that led from their temporary prison. Any reluctance the clergyman had felt about leaving his sanctuary had clearly disappeared now that the danger was gone. Excuse me a moment, sir." Jack nodded as he left the Maharajah's side and walked over to the barricade. He heaved a bullet-scarred wooden crate to one side, leaving an opening big enough for even young Somers to squeeze through. He spotted Isabel trailing behind, but there was no opportunity to catch her eye before her father's bulk screened her from his view. "I cannot fathom why you left me in that infernal place, Danbury. You should have brought me with you." Young Somers admonished Jack as he pushed past the barricade, easing his hefty buttocks through the narrow passage that now looked a lot smaller than when Jack had first tugged the crate away. "It really was badly done, Danbury. Badly done indeed." "You were indisposed?" Jack tried to sound pleasant in the face of the undeserved rebuke, well aware that the Maharajah was listening to every word. "I didn't want to risk causing you any further harm." Like a stubborn cork finally wrenched from a bottle, young Somers forced his way out through the barricade. "Nonsense, man!" He was clearly not appeased by Jack's words. "You left me to fend for myself when you had been sworn to protect me. But enough of that for the moment. There will be plenty of time for an inquest at a more suitable juncture. For the moment, please do me the honour of telling me just who these fellows are." He'd apparently regained some of his usual bombastic style. "I cannot say I recognise them." The clergyman peered down his thick nose as he tried to identify the uniform of the men who had saved him. "Truly?" Jack was surprised. He understood that young Somers had been in Bundapur for nearly a year. Surely he must have some idea as to the identity of the Lancers and their leader. "Do not be impertinent. I never ask a question if I already know its answer." Young Somers was growing in confidence again as he sensed a number of the Lancers looking in his direction. "Pray tell me who these blackguards are, so that I may decide what course of action is best. It will fall to me as the senior official here to negotiate with these ruffians." He seemed to puff up with the importance of his own words, relishing playing to the audience. Holding out a hand, he summoned Isabel to his side, taking her arm and wrapping it protectively around his own. It was an indication of her distress that she obeyed meekly, and Jack felt an immediate concern for her well-being after all she had witnessed in the past day and night. "If you would be so kind as to introduce me to their leader, Danbury." Young Somers continued to sneer as he spoke, clearly unimpressed at being faced by the Lancers. "The damn savage won't likely understand a word we say, but we must show willing." "Certainly, Reverend. It'll be my pleasure." Jack heard the sarcasm in his own voice. He stepped back a few paces so that he could usher the Maharajah into the conversation. "Reverend young Somers, may I introduce the Maharajah of Sawad?" Jack turned to the Maharajah, delighted at the look of utter astonishment on the clergyman's face. "Sir, may I introduce Reverend young Somers, the chaplain at Bundapur, and his daughter, Isabel." The Maharajah greeted the introduction with a huge guffaw. He stepped forward, clapping his hand forcefully on Jack's arm as he did so. "You are a scoundrel, Danbury." The comment was muttered and solely for Jack's benefit as the Maharajah moved towards young Somers, who was visibly shaking as the foreign ruler approached. "Delighted to meet you at long last, my dear Reverend. I've heard much about you." The Maharajah reached forward and shook young Somers by the hand. If he was put off by the clergyman's limp and unenthusiastic grip, he did not let it show. A wide smile crept across his face. Good Lord!" young Summers stammered as he spoke. The Maharajah paid him no heed, his attention now focused fully on Isabel, who curtsied demurely, lowering her eyes before looking up at him through her thick lashes. "Isabel Young Summers." The Maharajah rolled the name on his tongue as if tasting it. "I had been told you were a rare beauty, but those reports did not do you justice." He bowed at the waist as he offered both hands to Isabel, gently lifting her back to her feet. Isabel blushed at the flattery, the flush of colour spreading from her neck to her pale cheeks. "You are too kind, sir." "No need for modesty, my dear. I merely speak as I find it is one of the privileges of being a king." "My liege, if I could have a moment." Young Summers cleared his throat noisily before carrying on, clearly unsure how to address the Maharajah. "May I inquire what you intend to do with us?" A trace of annoyance flared on the Maharajah's face as the Reverend interrupted his study of Isabel. "Do with you? I have no notion what I shall do with you." "Well, sire, in that case, I must insist you return us to the nearest British establishment with all due haste." Young Summers frowned as he saw that his daughter remained the subject of the Maharajah's intense scrutiny. He ploughed on, trying to speak in a suitably grave tone. "Otherwise, I cannot be held accountable for what may occur." The Maharajah tore his eyes from Isabel and placed his hands on his hips as he pondered young Summers' bold choice of words. "Do you presume to give me orders, Reverend?" Not at all. Your Highness, not in the slightest." Young Summers was clearly flustered. The Maharajah stood uncomfortably close, the force of his personality making the clergyman regret ever having opened his mouth. "I merely wish to point out that the authorities will not be pleased should they learn that you did not permit us to return to our rightful place as soon as possible." "The authorities? What authorities? Am I not the only authority that matters here?" The Maharajah stamped his foot in obvious irritation. "Yes, Your Majesty, of course." Young Summers fluttered his hands in front of his wide stomach, as if to shoo the Maharajah away. He looked around for support, but Jack was in no mood to assist. "I meant no insult. I merely wish to ensure the safe return of my daughter to the station at Bundapur." "Good. I hope we understand each other, Reverend. I would hate there to be any confusion. For the moment I must ask you to be patient. It is nearly dawn, so I suggest that you rest as best you can. I will have one of my men bring you some food." Young Summers nodded in mute acceptance, clearly relieved that the Maharajah was bringing the conversation to a close, the promise of food enough to buy his silence. The Maharajah turned and stalked away. More blue-coated lancers were arriving on the blood-stained hilltop, the carbines on their saddles revealing the identity of the gunmen who had succeeded in forcing the bandits to gather together. The Maharajah welcomed them with loud praise, leaving the 3 former prisoners to themselves. Jack did his best to compose himself. They had been saved from the tiger, but they were still not yet safe. The country was on the brink of war. When it came, there would be no refuge for anyone with a white face, not until the Maharajah and his army had been destroyed. Dawn crept across the far horizon, reds, oranges and ochres rushing to paint the sky with warmth, banishing the forbidden colours of the night. The first grazes of blue followed quickly, heralding the azure vastness that would fill the heavens until dusk. The world came to life. The animals that had survived the bandits' ransacking of the village started to voice their protest at being confined, a cacophony of bleats, grunts, barks and hisses greeting the dawn. The Lancers' horses added their own noise, urging their masters into activity. As the last grey shadows of the night crept stealthily away, the cavalrymen bustled into life, beginning the long list of chores that had to be done to prepare themselves and their horses for the day ahead. The 3 former prisoners sat in silence around a simple fire that the Lancer charged with their care had coaxed to life. They had broken their fast on some of the rations the cavalrymen carried in their saddlebags, none of which had managed to meet Reverend Youngsummer's high expectations. "If only they had been able to locate our provisions, then we would not be forced to eat this muck." For the umpteenth time, Youngsummers lamented the loss of his picnic, as he stared sorrowfully at the dried mutton and hard bread he was continuing to eat at a healthy rate, despite his misgivings. Jack forced himself to his feet, urging his aching joints into action. He watched the Maharajah's lancers as they went about their duties, running a professional eye over the troops he might one day have to fight. He was impressed by what he saw. The blue-coated cavalry worked with the industry of trained soldiers, their movements practised and efficient. Everything he saw told him that Major Dutton had been too complacent in his judgment of the Maharajah's army. The British contingent at Proudfoot's disposal was beginning to look woefully inadequate. A series of loud shouts interrupted his casual inspection of the lancers. Like any good commander, the Maharajah had established a number of vedettes, and now a single rider was spurring hard up the slope to the top of the hill where the bulk of the lancers had made their bivouac. Jack brushed away the dust that covered his uniform. He turned to face the direction the rider had come from, kneading the small of his back to work away some of the nagging pain that the hours on the hard ground had awoken. His hands froze in place. A column of soldiers had marched into view. Even from a distance there was no mistaking the red coats that had been made famous on countless battlefields in the 4 corners of the globe. The British army had arrived. Jack stood to one side as the column of redcoats marched up the hillside. The sun was still low in the sky, but already the heat of the day was starting to build. He felt the first prickles of sweat emerge as he did up the last of the brass buttons on his heavy scarlet coat, forcing the stiff collar into place and setting his shako straight on his head. He might have been missing his weapons, but he did his best to look as presentable as possible as he prepared to greet his new command. The Maharajah ordered his own men to form up in column as he readied them to meet the arrival of the British forces. He stationed himself at the front of his troops, lolling easily in the saddle as he waited for the foreign soldiers whose presence in his land so grated on his pride. Jack watched the redcoats closely. The tight column lost some of its order as the men struggled to maintain their spacing on the slippery, loose soil and rock of the scree slope, which continually gave way under their feet. He savoured the opportunity of leading a company again, eagerly anticipating the coming months and weeks when he would get to know every facet of his new command. It was the privilege that he coveted most, the one that meant so much more than all the gaudy trinkets that bedecked an officer's life. Despite all he had experienced since he had first stolen James Danbury's identity, he still felt pride as his red-coated soldiers marched resolutely on. Reverend Youngsummers strode forward to greet the column, arms spread wide in greeting. As Jack listened to the clergyman's sonorous voice delivering a loud prayer of thanks for his deliverance, he continued to watch his new command carefully, assessing their bearing after what must have been a long and draining night march. He was pleased with what he saw, the men marching with elan as they showed off their skills in front of the Maharajah and his lancers. He read the expressions on many of the faces, recognising the mix of anxiety and distrust of infantrymen parading in front of cavalry. He smiled, understanding the feeling well. The smile faded as he noticed the presence of Lieutenant Fenris. His dashing subaltern sat his fine white horse well, riding with grace and composure despite what had been a long ride from the British cantonment. Jack was about to move forward and offer his own greeting when he noticed that there was a second officer present with his company. He froze, staring at the man in confusion. He could not comprehend why there should be another officer wearing the uniform of a captain in the 24th Foot, a uniform identical to the one Jack himself wore. He closed his eyes as it all began to make sense. He had thought the army would be slow, that the long protracted negotiations that followed the death of an officer on campaign would give him months before the real Captain Danbury's commission could be sold. He had been utterly wrong. The presence of the second mounted officer proved his assumptions to be nothing more than hopeful folly, condemning him to a bitter future, one that would likely lead to a cold dawn on the scaffold. The new owner of the late Captain Danbury's commission had arrived. Jack's charade was over before it had barely begun. Chapter 14. "There's the damned impostor! Arrest him!" Lieutenant Fenris bellowed the accusation as soon as he clapped eyes on Jack, his voice rising in excitement. "What on earth?" Young Summers's prayer was quickly forgotten as Fenris bounded from the saddle and rushed past the astonished clergyman. Jack had always known this moment could come, but he had believed he would be safe for longer than the few days he had spent at Bundapur. He cursed his fortune, but straightened his spine and resolved to meet his denunciation with as much dignity as he could muster. He had often wondered how he would face it. He had imagined every reaction, anger, fear, denial, but had never conceived that he would feel so little. His heartbeat had barely increased in the time since Fenris had shouted his crime aloud, despite the look of shock and horror he saw appear on Isabel's face. "You damned blackguard!" Fenris's lips pulled back in anger as he snarled the words. Jack could see the younger officer's body vibrating with barely controlled rage. The intention to strike was obvious, his right hand already balled tightly into a fist and moving upwards, the blow driven by all his pent-up anger. He grasped Fenris tightly by the forearm before it had travelled more than a few inches. There was time enough to register the shock on the young officer's face before Jack snapped his forehead forward, smashing it into the centre of Fenris's face. The leading rank of redcoats dashed forward at the double as their officer hit the ground. Led by a corporal whose name Jack could not place, they hefted their muskets, ready to use them against the man they had been ordered to arrest the moment they arrived. Jack lifted his hands in surrender. His forehead might have throbbed from the blow, but there was a satisfaction in seeing Fenris on the floor, cupping his hands over his broken nose in a futile attempt to staunch the flow of blood that gushed from the wound. "No rumpus, all right?" The corporal asked the question hopefully, clearly not relishing the unpleasant task of arresting the man he had believed was his commanding officer. "I'll not cause you a problem, Corporal." Jack kept his eyes on Fenris as he spoke, wary of a sudden attack. But the sight of his own blood had dampened the lieutenant's urge to fight. "You'll hang, you bastard," Fenris gasped, the effort of speaking jarring his battered face. "Hang? Who will hang? Would someone please tell me what is going on?" Isabel Youngsummers had rushed over as soon as Fenris had hit the ground. She now demanded an answer to her question, her wavering voice betraying her shock. Her father had chosen to ignore the confrontation and was instead engaging the new captain of the 24th with a barrage of questions, accusations and commands. The Maharajah and his lancers stood immobile, content to remain spectators so long as the British chose to fight amongst themselves. Isabel squatted to the ground, deftly extracting Fenris's handkerchief from his pocket. She pressed it to the centre of the lieutenant's face, whilst using her free hand to tilt his head backwards so that he looked to the sky. "That man is a damned impostor, and he'll hang for his crime." It was hard to make out the words as Fenris tried to speak and breathe through his mouth at the same time, but Isabel understood enough to offer a shocked gasp. "An impostor? I don't believe it. Danbury, tell me what is going on here this instant." "He's quite correct." Jack fixed his eyes on Isabel's. "I am an impostor. I'm not Danbury. I'm not even an officer." "Isabel, that bloody hurts!" Fenris tried to push away Isabel's hand, which gripped his nose tightly as she tried to make sense of Jack's revelation. The protest brought her out of her silence. "You are not Captain Danbury?" "No. My name's Jack." "And you are a fraud and a blackguard, and I shall piss on your grave." Some of the fire was returning to Fenris's belly as Isabel's presence urged him to show more courage. "Arthur!" Isabel released Fenris's bloodied nose, causing him to curse as the action sent a bolt of pain through the centre of his brain. "He is correct. I may well hang." Jack leant down and offered Isabel his hand. "Why? Why must you hang?" She took his hand, rising to her feet so that she stood barely a foot from him. Jack wanted nothing more than to reach out and run his hand through her hair. She had done her best to assert some order to its appearance, clipping it with the hairpins that had so caught his attention when he had first seen her at Proudfoot's soiree. But her work had been temporary at best, and more than one errant lock had escaped her hastily constructed arrangement and now whispered across her face. "I must hang as an example to others. I have broken Queen's regulations, and so I will be punished." "But why did you do it?" Isabel gripped his hand hard as she questioned his motives. "You must have known it would end like this one day." "Because I had nothing else." Isabel opened her mouth to speak, but thought better of it and instead stood in silence, her hand in Jack's, trying to understand the sudden revelation. "You did it because you're a knave and a thief, and you'll hang, you bastard, because you damn well deserve it." Fenris staggered to his feet, using the green cuff of his scarlet jacket to mop up the last of the blood still trickling from his nostrils. "Corporal, put this man in manacles and guard him well." He took firm hold of Isabel's arm, propelling her forcefully out of Jack's grip and leading her back towards her father. "And strip him of his uniform," he added as he walked away, disdainfully turning his back on Jack, refusing even to look at him. "That bastard has no right to wear it." Jack submitted to the rough hands as they tugged his scarlet coat from his back. He retreated to the nothingness of his emotions, even as the manacles took him in their cold, remorseless grasp. He kept his eyes down, focusing them on a pile of dirt that was stained with Fenris's blood. He no longer had a part to play in this early morning scene, so like any good actor he tried to merge into the background lest the audience be drawn to him rather than those on the main stage. It was time to submit to his fate. Jack marched in the centre of the small column, the corporal and his guard surrounding him with their bared bayonets in case he lost his mind and tried to mount a desperate escape. His shoulders ached from the unnatural position they were forced to adopt now that his hands were manacled behind his back, and the pit of his spine ached dreadfully, dogging his every step. He focused on the pain, examining the way it surged around his body, using the hurt to dispel the despair in his soul. He had been given no opportunity to plead his case. The Maharajah had kept at a distance, treating the handover of the former prisoners as if it were not of a sufficient concern to trouble the attention of a king. Jack would have enjoyed a final conversation with the foreign ruler. He had sensed a kindred spirit, despite the huge gulf in their status. Yet, just as it had been when he was nothing more than a common redcoat, such familiarity was now denied him. The new captain of the 24th, whose name he had learnt was Kingsley, had avoided all contact with him, as if he would somehow become contaminated should he acknowledge the presence of the man who had dared to assume his commission. Jack was left to the care of the corporal of the guard, who treated him as well as the situation allowed. To Jack's dismay, he had not found an opportunity to speak to Isabel, who remained close to her father's side, as if tethered by some invisible rope. He was certain that any feelings she might have started to develop towards him would now have twisted into dark disgust as his deception was revealed in all its sordid glory. It was hard not to regret missing out on what might have been. But if he closed his eyes, he could still summon an image of the first girl he had truly loved. Remembering what he had lost made losing what might have been easier to bear. Kingsley, Fenris, and the men of the 24th had been forced to spend many uncomfortable hours in the remains of the village, waiting for the heat of the day to diminish before they could begin the long march back to Bundapur. Their return was further delayed by Reverend young Summers, who insisted on being allowed to sleep through the greater portion of the day, his claim of nervous exhaustion made with such conviction that neither Kingsley nor Fenris had been able to convince him to rouse himself until he was good and ready. With departure delayed so long, it would have been pragmatic to wait until the early hours of the following morning to set off, but the British officers were awkward in front of the Maharajah and his men, and so had ordered their small column to march late in the afternoon, even though there was no hope of reaching their destination before nightfall. Lieutenant Fenris argued long and loud for them to continue through the night. He was keen to reach Bundapur, anticipating the laurels he would win for carrying out the orders they had been given. The young officer had spoken loudly enough for Jack to learn that the column had been dispatched with the twin objectives of discovering what had happened to young Summers and his daughter, and also apprehending the impostor who had dared to arrive in their midst. Captain Kingsley, however, had been forced to listen to Reverend young Summers' tale of bandits and deadly ambushes, the clergyman's fears of a night march described with biblical vigour. Kingsley was not a man to take risks, his natural caution giving credence to the dangers outlined by young Summers, so the redcoats were ordered to take a bivouac in the darkness. When the column stopped for the night, Jack was left to find what rest he could, his hands still bound by the heavy manacles, but now at least in front of his body. The redcoats hastily built fires. They were grateful to sink to the ground with their mates, wholly unconcerned about a night spent away from the confines of their barrack rooms. Once the final orders of the day had been issued, the two British officers left the men to their own devices, the divide between the two groups as rigidly enforced in the field as it was in the cantonment. Jack was simply abandoned between them, ignored and alone, the addition of a set of ankle fetters securing him in place. "Jack?" Isabel used the name tentatively, and at first Jack didn't hear her. He had been lost in another world, reliving his life as an orderly, remembering the days of serving his first officer as if it had just been a few weeks previously and not so many months ago. "Jack?" She spoke with more force, refusing to be ignored. "What?" Jack's voice came out as a croak. His mouth and throat were parched, and it felt as if he had to physically tear his tongue from the roof of his mouth to be able to speak. "It's Isabel." She spoke in the careful tone of the young to the old and decrepit. Jack squinted through a single eye as Isabel crouched beside him. He could smell her, the subtle scent of a woman's sweat underscored with that lingering trace of perfume. She looked downcast at his silence. She removed the stopper to a full canteen of water and offered it. Jack took it gratefully in both hands, relishing the opportunity to slake his thirst, his body trembling with desire the moment he felt the first precious drops moisten his tongue. "Thank you." He handed back the canteen awkwardly, the heavy iron manacles making his movements laboured. Isabel placed the canteen to one side and sat cross-legged on the ground beside him, looking every inch the schoolgirl she had so recently been. "No more lies," she spoke quietly, guarding her emotions. "I just want the truth." She searched Jack's eyes to see if he understood. Was everything just an act? No, not all of it. Jack closed his eyes as he remembered the desperate struggle in the prison they had shared. When he opened them again, he saw her watching his face closely. "I cannot pretend to fight." "You fought to save me, just as you promised." "I did. I figured you were worth the effort." "I have never thanked you." "There was no need. You were only threatened because I failed to protect you properly. I should have seen the danger the moment those bloody bandits opened fire. I should have got you away." He did not try to contain his bitterness. He had thought he had found a place in life, his ability in the searing cauldron of battle, the one thing he had believed he could rely upon. The failure rankled, stinging his stubborn pride. "You were not to know." Isabel shuddered as she remembered the dreadful fight. "I fought, but I lost. It's not the first time." "Why? When did you lose before?" Jack looked at Isabel, wondering if he should open the darkest recesses of his soul. The desire to share his past was strong, but he could not burden the young girl with his bitter memories. It would not be fair, and soon none of it would matter anyway. "I loved somebody once. It didn't work out as I planned." Jack contented himself with revealing the half-truth. "You must have loved her very much." The words astonished him. Isabel did not avert her eyes as he looked at her in amazement. "How can you tell?" "How?" Isabel smiled for the first time. "It's easy. You carry your sorrow in your eyes." She reached out her hand, placing it gently on top of Jack's. "I think you have suffered enough." "I don't think Fenris would agree." "Arthur acts like a spoiled child. You dared to offend his precious dignity, and so he hates you." "But he likes you." Jack felt a sudden rush of jealousy at the notion. Isabel would have to have been made of stone not to find the dashing young officer attractive. Fenris must have turned her head. He most certainly would have tried. "I know." She acknowledged Jack's observation. "He could be a fine man." She smiled at his choice of words. "He could be, but he is not. He is not for me." "I cannot say I'm not pleased." Jack matched her smile, turning his hand to squeeze her own. "You saved my life. I shall not forget that, Jack, no matter what happens." Jack slowly shook his head. "No." He spoke firmly, letting go of her hand. "You owe me nothing. Consider it my final gallant act. My parting gift to the world.
"Isabel, come here this instant!"
Reverend young Summers shouted across to his errant daughter, as if he had spotted her conversing with the devil himself. Isabel's head turned as her father shouted for her. The anger in his voice was clear. She sighed, and Jack felt her breath kiss against his cheek. Then she uncrossed her legs and got to her feet, her hands brushing her dress flat and knocking off any bits of dirt that had stuck to it as she sat on the ground. She looked down at Jack. "I will not forget what you did, Jack. Whatever you say." Without another word, she turned and walked away, her head bowed as she obediently returned to her father's side. She did not want him to see the desire on her face, or the spark of excitement in her eyes as she dared to consider doing something that would scandalize the tight-knit society in which she was forced to live. If only she could summon the courage. Chapter 15. Jack lay on his back, looking up at the stars. He had never paid them much heed before. Indeed, he did not think he had truly noticed them until he had left his mother's gin palace in Whitechapel to join the Redcoats. There was little sky to be seen in the stinking rookery in which he had been brought up. In the enclosed confines of the city, it was hard to even make out the sky in the narrow gaps between the tops of the buildings, or through the near-impenetrable smog that filled the air no matter what the season. In the rookeries, staring up at the heavens was asking for trouble. Letting your guard down, even for a single heartbeat, was a quick route to an early grave, a final trip down the Thames, the last resting place for so many of the denizens of the foul places where no one sane or sober chose to go. Now he gazed at a sky with more stars than he could count. He liked their serenity. Whatever happened, they continued to look down, unperturbed by sorrow or by war. They did not care if someone lived or if they died, if someone stole a scarlet coat or dreamt of a future far removed from the one allotted to them. The stars were always the same. He heard a noise, a scrabble of feet not far from where he lay. He closed his eyes, shutting off his view of the heavens as he concentrated his hearing on the sound. It could have been an animal. A whole menagerie of beasts stirred when the darkness arrived, to scuttle and hurry about their business through the cold night hours before the sun rose. Yet he could hear breathing, the subtle sound of someone trying very carefully to be completely quiet. "Jack!" The icy whisper still took him by surprise. His body jolted at the sudden call, a rush of blood surging through his veins to hammer noisily in his ears. Gingerly he eased himself into a sitting position, scanning the darkness. As he did so, his manacles and fetters clattered noisily. "Hush!" The voice urged him to silence. Jack did his best to obey, moving with infinite slowness as he manoeuvred round so that he could face the soft voice that had murmured from the darkness. He could just make out a thin silhouette bending towards him. "Hush yourself." He spoke quietly. He knew who had come to disturb his peace. "You shouldn't be here." "Be quiet." The voice delivered the rebuke with a little more force, its owner clearly annoyed that Jack was treating the situation in such a glib manner. "I've come to rescue you." Jack did his best not to laugh aloud at the bold announcement. "And how do you propose to do that, Isabel?" Isabel Youngsummers crept forward and gently slid to her knees beside him. Even in the dim light, Jack could see her flushed cheeks, the exhilaration at her escapade clear. She had bound her hair into a dark blue headscarf and swathed her body in a thick brown cloak, both for warmth and to deaden the brightness of her dress. If you are going to speak to me in that tone, then perhaps I'll not bother. You shouldn't be here, Isabel. Your father will have a fit if he finds out. He won't know. Isabel spoke quickly and quietly. She was right to be confident. It was unlikely anyone would hear her. The bivouac was never completely quiet, the sounds of men snoring, farting and fidgeting loud enough to cover any whispered conversation. The real danger came from a sentry spotting the extra silhouette near where Jack should have been sitting in isolation. Yet the sentry's job was to face outwards, scanning the ominous shadows for danger, so the risk of discovery was small, but that did not stop Jack fretting. Isabel would be severely rebuked for her exploits if she were discovered, and he did not want her to be punished for his sake. You should go back. Never, Isabel replied firmly. I shall never go back. Never? He wants to send me home. There was real pain in her voice. He has vowed to book me onto the next available steamship. He will send me to my aunt's, where I will sit and do nothing until I'm married off. I would rather die. He'll likely kill you himself if he discovers you talking to me. I'm not here to talk to you, you ninny. I said I have come to rescue you, and so I shall. Jack lifted his arms, showing her the heavy manacles that bound his hands, grimacing at the pain the gesture provoked. The skin around the clasps had been rubbed raw, chafed by the unyielding metal so that it was bloody and weeping. And what about these? Isabel smiled with devilment, her eyes alive with her own daring. Oh, I hadn't thought about that. Why? If only I had a key. Her hand fished beneath her cloak, and she produced a pair of heavy iron keys with all the panache of a music hall magician. Jack looked at her in admiration. Blow me. How did you get those? Isabel chuckled at the look of surprise on his face. Oh, now you're interested. You still want me to go back? Jack grinned. I do. But give me the damn keys first. Isabel pulled back her hand, removing the keys from his reach. Oh, no, you don't. If I give you these, you must promise to take me with you. Take you with me? Take you where, exactly? If I make a run for it, I'll be hunted like a damn fox. You would not want that. You're right, I don't. But we won't be on the run. Really? Perhaps you're an angel, then, using your godly powers to spirit us away. For there is nowhere to hide here. Isabel looked nervously over her shoulder as Jack took the Lord's name in vain. It would take a long time for her father's shadow to leave her side. There is. She spoke firmly and with obvious confidence. I've thought it all through. I know exactly where we shall go. And once we're there, no one will be able to reach us. My God, Isabel, are you corned? Did you steal some of your father's brandy? Isabel flickered her free hand forward, deftly delivering a gentle slap to his arm. Of course not. Then what's your plan? Where is this wonderful sanctuary? Where can we hide where no one will find us? Jack fired the questions at her, a trace of annoyance in his voice. He would be happy to risk an escape, for he truly had nothing left to lose. But he did not have high hopes of success. The local people would certainly not be willing to offer shelter to a white-faced stranger. But it was worth a try, if only to irk Lieutenant Fenris. We shall go to the Maharajah. He'll save us. We will join his court. She smiled the sweet smile of victory, for she was quite correct. She had thought of the one place where they would be safe. Only the Maharajah could save them now. Jack took Isabel's hand as they crept through the bivouac. He could see the sentries at their posts, the two pairs of redcoats staring dutifully into the darkness as they whiled away the long hours of their sentry duty. He kept a close eye on them as he led Isabel through the sleeping camp, hoping that no one could hear the pounding of his heart, which seemed loud enough to wake the dead. He kept well away from the slumbering redcoats, guiding Isabel in a wide circle as he aimed for the small group of horses that had been tethered together a short distance from where the officers had chosen to rest for the night. The camp was still in the dead hours after midnight, the last wakeful redcoats settling down for some rest before the next day's march, which would begin before the daylight crept back to scour the darkness away. Isabel let out a gasp of distaste as they moved out of the last light of the fires. "What on earth is that?" She raised a hand to her face, trying to protect her mouth and nose from the foul aroma. Jack turned and saw the look on her face. He grinned. "The latrine. Try not to step in anything." "That's horrid." Isabel's disgust was evident, but he had chosen the route with care. Anyone seeing movement heading towards the temporary latrine would think nothing of it. Many of the redcoats stumbled into the darkness to relieve themselves during the night. Once past the reeking pits, they would be able to move rapidly towards the horses that offered their best chance of escape. Jack risked a glimpse back over his shoulder as he led Isabel into the night. He had used her cloak to improvise the slumped shape of a sleeping figure, arranging it so that anyone checking on him would see what looked like a slumbering form. It would not fool his captors for long when the company prepared to march, but by then he hoped he and Isabel would be far away. He rubbed at the sores on his wrists, relishing the freedom of movement. He had learnt from bitter experience that even the worst pain did not last forever, even the most vicious of wounds healing with time. At least, that was true for wounds to the body. Wounds to the soul were different, only ever scabbing over, the tears and fissures left to fester beneath. But he had learnt not to pick at those, letting them rot in the depths of his mind, the pain dulled by familiarity yet never completely going away. It did not take long to reach the horses. He let Isabel go first. She was more experienced with the animals than he was. She moved forwards quickly, murmuring sweet nothings as she approached the horse she had ridden that day. It gave a quiet whinny of recognition and blew loudly through its nostrils as it smelt the open hand Isabel held to its nose. Jack looked around, anxiously scanning the slumbering bivouac for signs of alarm. All was still. The redcoats blissfully unaware that the impostor they had been sent to arrest was making off. He saw the sleeping form of Lieutenant Fenris, the young officer enjoying the peaceful rest of the victorious. Jack only wished he could be there when Fenris realized that the prisoner had escaped. He smiled at the notion. He knew there was unfinished business between the two of them, the kind of business that could only be settled sword in hand. As Isabel deftly saddled two of the horses, he wondered when that encounter would come. For he knew Fenris would not rest until he had been brought low, the lieutenant's hatred sure to be fanned by his disappearance with Isabel. He relished the idea. He would not shirk from the fight, whenever it came. Chapter 16. Isabel, it's time to get up. Jack gingerly nudged the sleeping form with the toe of his boot. He could make little sense of where her body lay under the thick wrappings of blanket, and he hoped he had not inadvertently poked a sensitive area with his unsubtle alarm call. "Isabel." He spoke again, raising his voice to make sure it penetrated the cloth that swaddled her head. To his satisfaction, he saw her start to stir, and almost certain that she would heed his call to rise, he returned to the fire that he attended during the long, lonely hours of the night. They had ridden through the dawn, then on throughout the long, hot day until after night had fallen. He had seen Isabel swaying in the saddle, her exhaustion obvious. As much as he would have liked to keep going, he had sensed that she was at the end of her strength. They had unsaddled the horses and created a meagre sanctuary on a lonely, windswept hillside, sheltering as best they could amongst a group of large boulders. He picked up a stick and stabbed the fire back into life. It had been a tedious night. He had chosen to sit and keep watch despite his tiredness, nervous that they would be discovered despite the distance they had covered. The anxiety had gnawed at him, but he did his best to keep it contained, forcing himself to sit still whilst Isabel slept. She would need her full strength should they be forced to avoid any persistent pursuit during the coming day. He kept his eyes low, concentrating on the flickering flames that danced into life in front of him. He craved a decent drink, sorely missing the reviving effects of some tart green coffee or the thick, tarry soldier's tea that was made wherever British redcoats rose to face the day. He wondered if there would be tea at the Maharajah's court, and he walked over to search through the saddlebags on Lieutenant Fenris's horse to see if the British officer had possessed enough sense to carry some with him. The image of Lieutenant Fenris rising the previous morning to see that his prisoner had not only escaped, but had also taken the young officer's horse with him, crept into Jack's mind. It was a notion to savour, and he found himself chuckling softly as he pictured the rage that must have surely followed. "And what is amusing you this morning?" Isabel tiptoed across to sit in front of the fire, still swaddled in the thick army blanket that had kept her warm through the chill hours of the night. "Fenris. I was imagining how he must have reacted when he discovered I'd stolen his horse." Jack gave up his search, muttering a curse under his breath at the lieutenant's feckless decision not to carry any of the precious leaves. He walked back to the warmth of the fire, contemplating a day without tea. Poor Arthur. Isabel looked wistful as she carefully took a seat next to Jack. Poor Arthur, my eye. He felt not a single ounce of sympathy for his former lieutenant. It's no more than he deserves. Isabel grinned mischievously. And father will be furious. She relished the statement, her satisfaction at her father's distress obvious. Jack looked hard at the young girl sitting opposite him. He could only marvel at her spirit. She had left her family behind, gambling her future and potentially her life on a wild adventure with only a proven criminal for a companion. Yet she did not seem the least bit perturbed at her actions. Even a night spent with only rocks for a bed had done nothing to dampen her ardour for the escapade. "Will they still come after us?" she asked, wrapping the blanket tightly around herself to ward off the morning's chill. "They might. They'll want to, that's for certain. But I reckon they'll have no choice but to go back to Bundapur and report what's happened. Proudfoot will have to be told, so I imagine we're safe for the moment." "Proudfoot will be cross." Jack shook his head at the childish turn of phrase. "He won't be cross. He'll be apoplectic. I almost wish I was there to see him give those bastards a tongue-lashing." "Poor Arthur. And poor Captain Kingsley. He's only just arrived, and now he'll be in trouble with his commander." "Save your pity for us." Jack poked the fire with force, causing it to flare up. "We still don't know where we're bloody going." Isabel pouted at Jack's obvious irritation. "There's no need to look like you're sucking on a lemon. I didn't hear you mention that when I rescued you." "I had other things on my mind." "Well, more fool you. I cannot be expected to think of everything. I got you free, didn't I?" Jack reached out and pressed his hand onto Isabel's. "I am grateful. Truly. I just wish I knew which way to go. It's up to me to keep you safe." Isabel looked down at his hand, but made no move to remove it from her own. It was the first intimate contact they had shared since they had ridden off into the night, and it promised much. "Will you tell me your name?" She asked the question quietly. "Does it matter?" Jack matched her tone. He could feel the warmth of her hand underneath his. He concentrated on how it felt as his fingertips moved gently to ease out a pattern on her skin. "I would like to know who you are." "You will not find that in my name." He smiled at his own pomposity. "It's Lark. Jack Lark." She did not speak again, satisfied by the revelation. They sat together, staring out into the wild, barren landscape, sharing the moment. "I suppose I'd better get ready." Isabel sighed as she broke the spell between them. "I expect you will want me to ride all day again." Jack took his hand back, immediately missing the feeling of Isabel's warm skin. "I expect so. But we need to find out where to go." "Perhaps we can ask." Jack chuckled at the notion. "I'm not sure I speak enough of the local language to ask for directions. Do you?" "No." Isabel smiled at her own foolishness. "The servants all spoke English. I do speak French, though, and a little Latin." Jack laughed aloud. "Well, that should prove useful." He enjoyed watching the expression on Isabel's face, savouring the sight of her fresh beauty. "I knew a fellow who spoke Latin once. He went quite mad." Isabel laughed along with him. They continued to sit together, enjoying each other's company, comfortable in the silence. "Jack." Isabel was serious when she spoke again. "Are we in danger?" He opened his mouth, his first thought to scotch the idea immediately. But he had spent too long living with lies to begin this new life with more of the same. "Yes." He watched her closely, looking for a flicker of fear in her emerald eyes. "Our best hope is to come across some of the Maharajah's men. Then at least we have a chance. Though I suspect they'll do nothing more than escort us back to Bundapur. If we encounter anyone else, then there's not a lot I can do. I don't even have a weapon." He smiled ruefully at the admission. "If it comes to that, we'll have to ride for it." "At least you will. I suspect I will simply fall off." He tried to make light of the situation, yet there was little he could do to disguise the peril into which they had plunged so willingly. "I know you will keep me safe, Jack. I've seen you fight, remember? I know how vicious you are." Isabel shook off her fear, choosing instead to copy Jack and do her best to lighten the mood. Jack laughed at her choice of words. "Vicious? I thought I was rather heroic." He was pleased to see her smile back. "My hero." She fluttered her eyelids in a theatrical gesture of adoration, before quickly rising to her feet. "Now, I must ask you to turn your back so I can get ready." "Yes, milady." Jack knuckled his forehead in a gesture of obedience. "Unless I can be of some assistance. I was once an officer's orderly, you know." "No, thank you," Isabel said firmly. "I shall manage quite well on my own. You must promise not to peek." "I promise." He made a show of inching round so that he faced the opposite direction. "I shall not dare to watch. Who knows what I would see?" "You'd better not. I'll be keeping an eye on you." Isabel wagged her finger at Jack's back. She had thought she would feel awkward in his company. After all, she had never been left alone with a man before. She walked back to where she had abandoned her few belongings, all that she now possessed in the world. She tried to feel concern for her future, summoning up the image of her father to elicit some feelings of sorrow or of guilt. but she felt nothing save excitement. They might not know where they were going, but she would not turn back. Not now, not ever. Jack and Isabel rode on to the higher ground. Mountains rose around them like battlemented towers, their soaring pinnacles and spires reaching far up into the dark blue vastness of the sky. They saw little sign of life, nothing but the birds of prey that soared on the eddies of hot air swirling far above. They had hoped to find a village or at least some form of habitation, but few of the locals were foolish enough to try to eke out an existence in this barren region, and they saw no evidence of settlement other than some abandoned forts perched high on distant hilltops. Yet not all was bare and lifeless. Occasional folds or dips in the ground supported lush patches of vibrant growth, a rare treat for the eyes that otherwise saw nothing but the dusty grey of the scree slopes around them. These pools of life boasted vivid colours, the bright red, blues, purples and oranges of the mountain flowers offering a stark contrast to their dull surroundings. Occasionally the sound of moving water interrupted the lonely quiet, the gentle trickle of a mountain stream or the subtler noise of a thin smear of water sliding across the rocks. Otherwise it was silent, the only noise their horses' hooves as their iron-shod feet clattered heavily on the rocky soil. They rode on, surrounded by the vastness of the highlands, the far-reaching views of ravines, sharp peaks, towering mountains, leaping waterfalls, and never-ending sloping hillsides only adding to the feeling of isolation. They spied the dust cloud long before the horsemen came into view. The open ground gave them no place to hide, the barren slope they were on bereft of all living things save for a scattering of thorny bushes and scrubby plants. It was tempting to immediately gouge their spurs into the sides of their tired horses, forcing them into a reluctant gallop in a bid to be far away before the unknown riders came close. But the long morning in the saddle had dampened the desire for more time spent meandering around the bare hills with no clear idea of where they were headed. So instead of flight, they stopped and waited to see who else was journeying through the high ground far to the east of Bundapur. "Be ready to gallop." Jack pulled his horse to a halt as he prepared Isabel to flee. His lack of skill on horseback left him standing impotently a good yard and a half behind Isabel, who shook her head in mock despair as she saw what he had been trying to do. With a deft flick of her reins, she edged her own horse backwards and to the side so that she could stand next to him, her skills instinctive. "You really do need some lessons in how to ride, don't you, Jack?" she teased. It was never high on my list of priorities. Jack squinted hard, trying to identify the approaching riders. We didn't have an awful lot of horses where I grew up. He thought of the area around his mother's gin palace. The only animals he had ever seen were the many mangy dogs that managed to exist on the rubbish and noxious offal that littered the streets. His former self could never have imagined even being close to a horse, let alone riding one. How remiss! Isabel seemed genuinely baffled at the notion of not being able to ride. "I cannot imagine my childhood without my ponies. What is life without a good ride?" Jack smiled at the innocent naivety of her remark, but kept his eyes fixed on the party of horsemen that was now making directly for them. It was clear they had been spotted and were now firmly in the other riders' sights. "There are 4 of them," Isabel announced suddenly, breaking the silence that had fallen over them as they both squinted into the bright lights. "Your eyes are better than mine." Jack relaxed his face, giving up the effort of trying to identify the approaching horsemen. "Are they in uniform?" It was hard to sit and wait for Isabel to answer the question. His worst fear was that they were being approached by a group of bandits. He tried to convince himself that it was unlikely the local dacoits paraded around on horseback, but he knew he would have little chance of fighting off even an unarmed schoolboy. Isabel was right to chide him for his incompetence, At anything other than a gentle walk, it was all he could do to stay in the saddle. Quite how anyone could fight and ride at the same time was beyond him. "They are dressed all in blue." Jack tensed as Isabel gave him the vital information he needed. Lancers. There was little comfort in knowing who they faced. The vivid memory of nearly being run through by the Maharajah's lance was still fresh. "What shall we do?" Isabel turned to face Jack as she posed the question. They had discussed the chances of meeting some of the Maharajah's forces. At the time it had seemed the best thing that could happen to them. But now that 4 of the Maharajah's elite lancers were bearing down on them, the idea that they could meekly request safe passage to their leader's citadel suddenly seemed incredibly naive. "We wait. Let's hope they're feeling friendly." "And if not?" Isabel reached across, resting her hand on Jack's leg as she sought reassurance. Jack barely felt her touch. He sensed his body tensing as it did in the moments before battle. This time he was unarmed and completely unable to fight. He had never felt so impotent. "Then you turn the head of that damned horse around and gallop like the fiends of hell are chasing you. You won't be able to keep up." Isabel's voice was mocking despite the danger. "I'll not even try." Jack reached down and took her hand in a firm grip. "But you must." He squeezed hard to emphasize the seriousness of his words. "I will delay them, and you will ride back to Bundapur and beg for your father's forgiveness." Isabel opened her mouth to protest, but Jack let go of her hand, silencing her with a raised finger. "You will do as I say, Isabel." He gave her no time to reply. Touching his heels to the sides of his horse, he eased into a walk. He would not sit and wait meekly for his fate to arrive. He gathered his reins into one hand, doing his best to adjust his weight to cover the slight tremor that threatened to topple him from the saddle. Then he lifted his free hand and rode to meet the Maharajah's lancers. Chapter 17. The fortress rose sharply from the plain. It dominated the skyline, demanding attention. It was a Prantara Durga, a hilltop fortress, and it had been made the home of the Maharajahs of Sawad for centuries. The walls were immense. Made from huge blocks of stone, they rose from the sheer sides of the hillside as if they had been carved from the very rock on which they stood. At their top, the battlements looked down on the wide plain with arrogance, the wide embrasures and merlons arrayed in tight, calculated patterns that would allow the defenders to pour a merciless fire on anyone foolish enough to try to assault the mighty fortress. Huge bastions had been built along the walls, bolstering the strength of the defence. This complex arrangement of wall and tower followed the contours of the hillside, forming 5 angled sides with a solitary gate at the very centre of the southernmost wall. The natural shape gave the fortress its name. It was the Tarangar, the Star Fort, and it was impregnable. The wide stone walls of the fortress had been built as far out as the hillside allowed, to create a wide area between them and the citadel that sat serenely in the very centre of the defences. Part palace and part stronghold, the Tarangar was the final bastion of the Maharajah's power. It had been attacked many times in the 500 years since it had first been built. Many local chiefs and rulers had cast envious glances at its imposing defences. None had come close to making good on their ambition, not a single assault breaching the walls, their hopes left to rot and fester amidst the corpses of their soldiers. The fortress had not been left to idle completely through the centuries. Successive Maharajas had sought to improve the defences, seeking to secure their advantage as the years passed and warfare changed beyond all recognition. Pragmatically minded engineers had been summoned to the distant site, their knowledge used to apply the latest stratagems of warfare, adapting the stronghold to better counter the many advances in the art of war. The power of gunpowder had brought about the most radical changes. To prevent the Taragar becoming nothing more than a relic of the past, an easy target for the cannons and siege trains that could destroy the proudest and longest-standing fortress in a matter of days. The height of the massive walls had been reduced, whilst their base was thickened and strengthened. The pattern of crenellations and merlons had been altered to create wide embrasures for dozens of cannon to be aimed outwards, their overlapping fields of fire calculated with meticulous care. The ancient citadel was given all the power of the modern world. Lest the cold application of mathematics and science leave the Taragar barren and ugly, the Maharajahs also summoned the finest architects and artists and employed the best craftsmen and painters to make sure that the palace hidden within rivaled the splendour of any other. Artworks, carvings and mosaics created a place of beauty within the steadfast fortress, a haven of luxurious tranquillity and charm wrapped in all the brutal trappings of war. Jack's neck ached from looking upwards for so long. He had stared in fascination at the fortress that loomed above them, its high walls and bastions towering over the small party that had made its way down from the high ground. The sheer sides of the hillside rose dramatically from the floor of the wide plain that surrounded it, the smooth rocky surface soaring upwards for 100 feet even before the walls themselves began. It was an impressive sight, and he could easily understand why the first Maharajahs had selected this location for their citadel. The ground began to incline under the feet of the horses as they started onto a broad ramp that began hundreds of yards from the main gate, turning sharply left and right at least a dozen times to make the approach to the single entrance long and slow. The breeze that had cooled them for much of the ride picked up as they mounted the exposed slope, the blue and white pennants near the tips of the lancers' weapons fluttering madly in the fast-moving air. Jack turned in the saddle, grimacing as the movement scraped at the sore flesh of his thighs, rubbed raw by the long ride into the depths of the Maharajah's kingdom. He looked across at Isabel, catching her eye and sharing a tired, fleeting smile as the end of their journey came into sight. They had barely spoken since they had spied the Maharajah's men. To their relief, the 4 lancers had been part of the force that had destroyed the tiger's stronghold. Their leader, a burly, heavily bearded fellow with thick gold bands on his sleeve, had recognized the couple as being the same white-faced foreigners they had rescued a few days previously. It had taken a great deal of gesturing and hand-waving to convince him that they were trying to return to the Maharajah, and Jack was still not sure if they now journeyed as guests or prisoners. Yet the lancers had escorted them in safety, and now led them up the long ramp to the entrance into the beautiful but cruel Taragar. The gateway to the citadel dominated the top of the ramp. The enormous timber gates were covered in hundreds of spikes arrayed in an ordered pattern so that not 1 inch was left uncovered, a defence against the might of the elephants that could be used by an attacker to try to batter a passage into the fortress. Each of the 2 massive gates had been pushed open to admit the long line of carts and wagons that was making the laborious climb up to the fortress. The lancers were forced to dawdle behind the bullock-pulled carts bringing fresh produce to the garrison, the narrow ramp leaving no space for them to force a way past. The delay gave Jack time to think and to prepare for meeting the Maharajah for a second time. As he studied the seat of the man's immense power, he started to doubt the wisdom of their choice. He no longer thought of the Maharajah as the kindred spirit to whom he had been able to speak so freely. The man who commanded such a mighty fortress could never be a friend, an equal. Their decision to throw themselves on the mercy of the ruler of this strange, very foreign land suddenly felt utterly foolish. By the time they neared the top of the long ramp, he had convinced himself that the most likely outcome was a period of incarceration before they were swiftly sent back to the British authorities. That would be the pragmatic thing for the Maharajah to do. After all, it was the British who now administered his land, and the return of the pair of escapees would certainly garner him favour. With a heavy heart, Jack resigned himself to facing the last moments of his temporary respite with as much grace as he could muster. The cool of the gatehouse was unexpected. Once past the thick gates, the small group of horsemen entered a narrow passageway that first turned sharply to the right, before almost immediately turning to the left. Curious as ever, Jack craned his neck as they passed through the dark space, trying to count the vast number of chutes and arrow slits that covered its walls and ceilings. Any attacking force that somehow managed to force the gates would find themselves in this murderous place, their movements confined by the walls, under constant attack through the multitude of openings that would allow the defenders to bring down a dreadful storm of missiles on their heads, with God knew what horrors poured through the wide chutes in the ceiling. The thought sent an involuntary shudder through him, and he felt as much of an interloper as any attacking soldier. As they reached the end of the passage, the small party was halted at the back of the queue of wagons that waited patiently for the guards to inspect each and every delivery. The guards were as neatly uniformed as the blue-coated lancers. Their livery was dark blue, with thick red seams running down their trousers. Their short coatees were decorated with red cuffs and collars with 3 rows of gold frogging across the front. On their heads were Kilmarnock caps, similar to those worn by Dutton's native troops, with red piping decorated the dark blue cloth that matched their coats. Jack noticed that several sported bright red sashes. These, along with thick white stripes on their sleeves, presumably denoted their higher rank. They were as smart a group of soldiers as he had ever seen. Even their full black beards were neat and uniform. It was as if the Maharajah had been able to replicate a single perfect specimen over and over again, creating an army from one faultless model. Their uniforms may have been as fine as any seen on the parade squares of the British cantonments, but their weapons showed that these were not merely ceremonial soldiers. Each guardsman wore a curving sabre at his hip that hung from a thick blue sash belted tightly around his waist, with a vicious-looking curving knife held in a separate scabbard in the small of the back. Jack could not fail to be impressed, and he once again wondered why Dutton had been so dismissive of the Maharajah's forces.
"You!"
The single barked word took Jack by surprise. They had been slowly inching towards the guards. There was still one cart in front of them when one of the Maharajah's men lifted a finger and pointed in Jack's direction.
"You there! I'm speaking to you!"
To Jack's astonishment, the words were delivered in a thick Scottish brogue.
"Are you deaf, man? I asked you a damn question."
The cart in front of them pulled away, the driver turning to look fearfully over his shoulder as he heard the raised voices around him. Jack watched him go with envy, wishing his own passage into the fortress could be so swift. The officer with the astonishing accent strode purposefully to stand at Jack's stirrup.
"Listen, laddie, I'll try to make this easy for you. Start by telling me your name."
Danbury. James Danbury. Jack used a name he had given the Maharajah when they had first met.
"See, that wasn't so hard now, was it? I am Sudabar Khan."
The guardsman introduced himself before turning away, issuing a rapid series of commands in a language Jack did not recognize. The lancers who had brought them to the fortress were clearly being dismissed, and they seemed more than happy to abandon Jack and Isabel to Khan's men, riding away without a backwards glance. Jack wondered if they were relieved to have passed on the responsibility for the two foreigners.
"If you and your lady friend could please dismount."
Khan stood back as he spoke, clearly expecting Jack to obey immediately, and looking up in obvious disappointment as he failed to do so.
"Now!"
The subadar pointed at the ground, in case Jack was having trouble understanding the request. Jack heard the tone in Khan's voice. As a redcoat, he had become well used to unquestioningly obeying his superiors. They might have hailed from very different armies, but it was clear that the subadar was used to a similar level of instant obedience. He looked across to Isabel and saw the same look of incredulity he was sure was on his own face. He shrugged and slid from the saddle, confident that Isabel would follow suit.
"That's better."
Subadar Khan towered over Jack as they finally stood face to face.
"You're gonna come with me. If you try any funny business, I'll rip your head off and shit in the hole. You understand that?"
Jack nodded, doing his best not to smile at the subadar's turn of phrase. Khan grunted in disapproval and turned to lead Jack and Isabel out of the entranceway and into the fortress proper. The antechamber was as comfortable as any room Jack had ever seen. Even the officers' mess back in Aldershot, where he had served as an orderly, compared badly to the opulent chamber that spoke of wealth and luxury on an almost unimaginable scale. Slim, silk-lined couches sat neatly on three sides of the room, each the deep purple of ripe plums and covered with a liberal layer of plump cushions decorated with intricate patterns of golden thread. The white marble floor was nearly completely covered with the deep reds and yellows of a Persian rug, whilst the walls were decorated with silk hangings that matched the colour of the couches. A series of richly coloured paintings ran around the room. They told the story of a hunt, a finely dressed rider depicted chasing down an enormous boar until in the final picture he stood astride the beast, his thick shafted spear buried deep in the animal's heart. Jack had a feeling that he would shortly know precisely how the boar felt. Isabel stood in front of this last painting, her fingers gently tracing the intricate carving on its frame, entranced by the detail of the work. Yet, for all its finery, the room had been chosen as a secure place to hold unwanted guests. There were no windows, and the single door was shut tight. Jack had heard the sound of a heavy bolt being thrown when they were left alone. It was a room of charm and elegance, but it was still a prison for all its opulence. Their cage might have been gilded, but they were as much prisoners now as they had been when captured by the tiger and his bandits. Jack rose swiftly to his feet the moment he heard loud footsteps outside the door to the antechamber. He had been perched on the edge of one of the couches, unwilling to lounge back into the luxurious seat lest he fall asleep the moment he relaxed. The door was thrown back, and Subadar Khan strode purposefully into the room, his face creased in a scowl. A thin-framed man followed him, trying to screen himself behind the guardsman's robust body. He was dressed in a simple white kurta with a sky-blue pagdi wrapped tightly around his head and a matching sash tied around his bony waist. In his hands he carried a thick red ledger on which he had carefully balanced a fine white quill and an ornate china inkwell.
"Sit there!"
Khan spoke curtly as he turned to wave his colleague to a free couch at one side of the room. The man hurried to obey the command, bending at the waist as he moved, as if trying to bow at the same time.
"I need some information from you both."
Khan turned his attention back to Jack and Isabel.
"Why don't you sit yourself down, laddie? This'll take a while."
"I'll stand." Jack stood foursquare in front of the native subadar. He was not daunted by the officer's size.
"As you like."
The corners of Khan's mouth twitched as if he were amused by Jack's belligerence. "Are you not going to introduce us?" Jack indicated the white-robed man, who immediately looked down at the floor in horror at being the subject of such attention. Khan looked disapprovingly at Jack. "No! Now, what are you doing here, laddie?" "We want to see the Maharajah." Khan gave a short bark of a laugh. "Oh, really? I'll just tell him you're here, shall I?" "Very good. We'll wait." "Funny, laddie. Very funny. So, you're not from the 24th? A deserter in his bint, is it? You'll not be the first, nor I suspect the last." Jack took a deliberate step forward. "Be careful who you call bint, Subadar Khan." He spoke slowly and carefully. He had played the part of an officer for long enough to know how to demonstrate authority, and for the first time he saw a shred of doubt on Khan's proud face. "My name is James Danbury, and I am a captain in Her Majesty's 24th Regiment of Foot. The Maharajah knows me. I was speaking with him just a few days ago. He nearly killed me, but I found it in my heart to forgive him for being so damn rude. My companion is Isabel Youngsummers, and the Maharajah knows her too. Not as well as he would like, but he knows her nonetheless." Jack spoke calmly, all the while keeping his eyes fixed on Khan's face. He could sense Isabel's growing impatience at being excluded from the conversation, and he just hoped she had enough sense to keep mum. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see the white-robed clerk, writing furiously to keep up, his eyes wide in horror as the white-faced foreigner spoke to the Subadar in such a forthright manner. "Now," Jack continued without pause, giving the native officer no time to interrupt, "I suggest you stop trying to frighten us and have someone tell the Maharajah we are here. I'm certain he's a busy man, but I believe he'll make time to see us." Jack turned to face the anxious scribe, who was scribbling away for all his worth. "Did you get all that?" Subadar Khan said nothing. He stared at Jack for what seemed a long time. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and awkward. "You're a bold fellow, laddie." Khan finally spoke, breaking the silence with a gentle chuckle. "Why should I believe all that horse shit?" Jack took a step forward, his face impassive. "If you call me laddie again, I'll rip off your balls and shove them down your damn throat." This time Khan laughed out loud. "I truly believe you would try. So it is to be Captain Danbury, is it?" "My name is Captain James Danbury, and I'm here to see the Maharajah." Jack felt his face flicker into a smile. It was hard not to like the straight-talking Subadar. Khan made a show of looking Jack up and down, his mouth puckering in distaste at the unkempt appearance of the man claiming to be a British officer. "Very well, Huzoor. I've never seen a mighty captain of the Sarkar who dresses as you do, but you're a strange folk, so I should suppose anything is possible." "Like finding an English-speaking officer in the service of the Maharajah?" Khan chuckled. "A Scottish missionary lived in my village when I was a boy. He taught me to speak English before my father saw sense and cut his throat. Life is odd, is it not?" Without another word he turned and marched from the room. The scribe immediately leapt to his feet to follow, dropping his quill in his haste. Jack bent and retrieved it, calmly handing it back to the terrified man, who scuttled from the room as if he had just seen the devil himself. Jack had done his best. They had flung themselves on the mercy of the Maharajah. Only time would tell if they had made the worst mistake of their lives. Chapter 18. Their footsteps echoed loudly on the marble floors as they were led through the corridors of the palace, the sound only partially muffled when they crossed one of the many carpets and rugs that were artfully displayed in the beautifully decorated spaces. Jack doubted he'd ever felt more out of place. A clumsy beast granted admittance to a world of shimmering and delicate beauty. He had never seen so much wealth. The walls were smothered with fabulous paintings, some small enough to fit into the pocket of his breeches, others big enough to cover an entire wall. Every few paces revealed another treasure, a bewildering array of jade, ivory, gold and silver statues and ornaments displayed on a series of exquisitely carved stone plinths. Each doorway was a work of art, the teak columns covered with a fine tracery of carvings and decorations. Glass chandeliers appeared one after another, their crystal beads and droplets glistening in the sunlight that streamed through the huge windows running down one side of every room. Isabel was entranced, her head turning quickly from side to side to catch every detail as they hurried after the blue-robed chamberlain who had appeared to lead them from their anteroom into the depths of the palace. The chamberlain's soft white slippers whispered across the marble floors, his movements controlled and subtle, so that it was as if he glided along, his elegant progress standing in stark contrast to Jack's bullish gait. Jack's discomfort made him feel belligerent, and he deliberately walked as loudly as he could. To his satisfaction, the chamberlain turned to look over his shoulder, the silent rebuke clear on his disdainful features. Even Isabel scowled at him, her warning look imploring him to behave. They walked through a dozen rooms, each as splendid as the one before. Their senses were assaulted with colour. Every room boasted a different shade of decoration, a subtle but noticeable contrast to its neighbour. Every object they passed was worth more than Jack had hoped to earn in a lifetime as a redcoat. The Maharajahs were clearly not coy about ostentatious display. The chamberlain stopped in front of a pair of closed doors that were guarded by 2 sentries wearing the same uniform as Subadar Khan and his men. Each was armed with a fearsome-looking spear that was almost as thick as Jack's arm, and from the look in their eyes he was certain that they were more than ready to use them, should anyone try to force their way past. "You will enter the chamber in silence. His Royal Highness is in Durbar, and you must not do anything to draw attention to yourselves." The chamberlain spoke fast, but in a hushed, reverential tone, the same kind of voice the orderlies used in the officers' mess when their masters were enjoying a post-lunch nap. He looked only at Jack. It was clear he expected Isabel to say and do nothing. "You will not look directly at His Majesty. You will not speak. You will not call out, and you will not walk like an elephant." His face puckered in distaste before he continued with his staccato list of instructions. "If His Royal Highness deigns to speak to you, then I shall call you forward. You must keep your eyes on the ground at all times, and you will prostrate yourself on the floor when I give the signal. You must remain there until His Royal Highness has finished speaking. Then you will get up and leave the room immediately. You must walk backwards, again looking at nothing but the ground." The chamberlain finished his speech with a badly contained sniff of disgust. Jack had struggled to understand the man's instructions, his thick accent making the words close to unintelligible. But the message was clear, and he felt a flutter of nerves in the pit of his belly. "Excuse me." Isabel spoke for the first time, only to be roundly ignored by the chamberlain. "What about me?" This time she reached out and touched the man's arm, determined to get his attention. The chamberlain's mouth twisted in obvious distaste at her touch. "You will be permitted to enter the room, but you will remain where I place you." "Am I not allowed to speak to the Maharajah?" Jack saw Isabel's left foot tapping a fast rhythm on the floor and wisely took a pace back. The chamberlain's eyes bulged at the very idea. "You are a woman. You will not be allowed to speak in Durbar." A pink flush was spreading up from the nape of Isabel's neck to colour her cheeks. "And why is that?"
"You are a woman," repeated the Chamberlain, turning away. Clearly he considered the matter closed. Isabel, however, did not. She reached forward, taking firm hold of his thin shoulder and pulling hard so that he spun around to face her once again. She was several inches taller than the sparsely framed man, and she loomed over him as she finally released the pent-up emotion she had kept contained ever since they had arrived at the fortress. "How dare you! I am a subject of the Queen, and I shall not be kept quiet. Nor will I allow myself to be treated like some piece of unwanted baggage. I have spoken to the Maharajah before, and I fully intend to do so again now." The Chamberlain waved his hands in front of him to ward off the enraged young woman, who looked ready to commit violence. "It is tradition." "Tradition, my eye! How I pity the women who have the misfortune to be born in your misbegotten country. Why, do you not know that a woman rules Great Britain? Would the Maharajah not deign to speak to her? Would he force the greatest queen this world has ever seen to remain silent?" "No, no, no," the Chamberlain whined in reply, his voice wheedling and imploring. "It is the way." "Isabel, leave the poor man alone." Jack decided to intervene lest their chance of seeing the Maharajah disappear. He's only doing his job. Isabel turned on him, her eyes flashing in fury. "So you think I should remain silent too? How dare you, after all I have done for you?" Yes, I do think you should remain silent if that is how things are done here. We cannot waltz in and expect them to lay out the red carpet for us. I expect to be heard. Oh, I'm sure the Maharajah will want to do more than just hear you. But you must wait. Isabel crossed her arms in front of her. "So I have to do as I am told?" "Yes." Jack smiled at the pouting face. "This time you do as you're bloody well told. Unless you want us to be clapped in irons and shipped back to Bundapur." Isabel sighed in resignation. "Very well. But don't you dare mess this up. If you do, I shall never forgive you." "I won't. Now, stand still and look pretty. I don't imagine the Maharajah will ignore you for long. It cannot be often that he has a beautiful English rose in his court." Jack turned and nodded to the Chamberlain, signalling that they were finally ready to enter the Durbar room. With a final haughty sniff, the Chamberlain signalled the guards to open the ornate double doors. The Durbar room was hushed. With its high vaulted ceiling it felt like a grand library, and the sombre silence pressed around Jack as soon as he followed the Chamberlain into the room. On one side, wide windows had been thrown open, and the air felt fresh, cooled by the breeze that rushed into the vast space. Everything in the chamber was white, with dramatic silk hangings around the windows that billowed theatrically in the breeze. After so many examples of dazzling colour and ostentatious display, the contrast was stark. The Durbar room was a haven of peace and tranquillity. Yet it was not completely silent. The sound of quiet conversation could be heard from the far end, where a crowd of onlookers were gathered, all listening with intense concentration. Jack was too far away to make out any individual words, as he walked as quietly as he could in the wake of the Chamberlain. As they approached the small gathering, the Chamberlain turned and gestured curtly for Isabel to wait to one side. A sarcastic smile stretched across his pale lips. The solemnity of the Durbar had done wonders to quell Isabel's temper, and she simply bobbed her head in acknowledgement of the command, meekly moving to the place the Chamberlain indicated. Jack did his best to place his boots with care as he once again followed the Chamberlain forward. His heavy tread still echoed loudly, and more than one face turned in annoyance as his entrance disturbed those straining to hear the murmuring voices at the room's end. One by one, the heads of the spectators turned to look at the Ferengi who had entered their midst. The majority of the room's finely dressed occupants were pressed to the flanks, leaving the end of the enormous space as a stage for the Durbar's prime participants. These were the figures that looked up last of all, their earnest conversation coming to a faltering close as Jack approached. He did his best to stand up straight as he became the focus of the room's attention. He wished he was dressed in uniform, the outer shell of a British army captain, a fine prop to a man's confidence. Instead, he faced the gathering of nobles wearing nothing more than a stained shirt and a pair of filthy trousers. There was no sign of the Maharajah, and for that Jack was grateful, as he felt his confidence wane in the face of such intense scrutiny. "Who are you?" The question was posed by one of the two men who had been engaged in the important conversation. The man took one look at Jack and shuddered in obvious revulsion at his filthy attire. Jack decided to ignore the Chamberlain, who was flapping his hand in a desperate attempt to get Jack to prostrate himself now that he was being addressed. "My name is Captain James Danbury." He hoped his voice conveyed the right balance of respect and confidence. "Danbury." The man stumbled over the foreign pronunciation. He was finely dressed in thick red robes that did little to hide his round belly. His head was swathed in a golden turban that had a pair of ostrich feathers attached to the front by a huge gold and diamond clasp. Each of his thick, stubby fingers was covered with gold rings, and around his neck was the biggest ruby Jack had ever seen. "I do not know a Danbury." "I'm with the 24th Foot, stationed at Bundapur, sir." Jack did his best to sound respectful. "No, I do not know you." The man's whole face wobbled as he shook his head. It was clear that he had heard all he needed to, and he turned his back on Jack, once again facing away from the rest of the room's occupants. The second figure laughed aloud at such posturing. He was the only man in the room dressed in uniform. Now he took a step forward and clicked his heels together before offering Jack a short, clipped bow from the waist. "Count Piotr Wysocki, once of the Regiment des Chevaux Légers, Lanciers de la Garde Impériale." Jack did not fully understand the Count's formal introduction, but there was something familiar in his choice of uniform. He had a hazy recollection of a painting in the officers' mess in Aldershot that depicted the charge of the famous Polish lancers at Waterloo. Count Piotr sported the same dark blue uniform with a crimson front panel to the jacket and a thick crimson stripe running down the seam of the snug pantaloons. Jack quickly understood the impact of the Count's presence in the Maharajah's court. "You must be responsible for the blue-coated lancers." Count Piotr bobbed his head enthusiastically. "Yes, they are my creation. Have you seen them?" Jack shivered involuntarily at the image of the Maharajah thundering towards him with his deadly steel-tipped lance aimed squarely at his heart. "I may have caught a glimpse of them." The Count's eyes twinkled at the reply. "Then you have seen how well I have trained them. They only had a rabble before I came. Now they have a full squadron of lancers that even the Emperor would have been proud to have in his service." Jack presumed that Wysocki was referring to Napoleon Bonaparte. The Count did not look old enough to have served the fabled French leader. Jack would have judged him to be in his mid-40s. If he had been at Waterloo, then that would have placed him firmly in his 60s. With a trim, athletic build and a lancer's uniform that fitted like a kidskin glove, it was hard to believe that that was the case. "I am sure the Maharajah is delighted to have a man of such experience as you in his service." Count Piotr laughed. "You will have to ask him.
I am not so sure he fully appreciates my talents."
"I hope I get the chance."
"Why not ask him now?"
The Count moved gracefully to one side, revealing the final occupant of the room. For the first time, Jack saw the simple wooden chair that had been placed strategically at the very end of the room. It was not the throne he had expected. In place of precious stones and exquisite carvings, there were simply the signs of long use and careful preservation. He found himself looking into the same eyes that had stared at him from behind the 8-foot reach of a lance. He was finally, once again, face to face with the Maharajah. Chapter 19.
"We meet again, Captain Danbury. Or are you going to tell me your true name this time? I must confess I'm finding this all rather confusing."
The Maharajah lounged with his right leg draped over one arm of the simple wooden chair, completely at ease with his surroundings. He was dressed very simply in a loose-fitting white shirt and snug white breeches. A pair of blood-red Cossack boots reached to just below his knees, his sole concession to vanity. The fat man who had treated Jack with such disdain wore more jewellery on one pudgy finger than Jack could see on the whole of the Maharajah's body. It was becoming clear, from both his appearance and the style of the durbar room itself, that the ruler of Sawad paid little attention to the opulent finery that so embellished the rest of his palace. Jack saw the smile on the Maharajah's face as he spoke. He hoped it was a good sign. "My name is Jack Lark, sir. I'm afraid the rest of it was just a pretense." Jack had no real idea how he should address the Maharajah. He had first met him dressed as an officer, and so it seemed natural to continue with that approach.
"I'm glad you finally feel able to tell me your name."
The Maharajah rubbed his hand vigorously against the bald dome of his head, as if physically clearing his mind.
"So, tell me, Jack Lark, why would you lie about who you are?"
His face showed intense interest, his eyes piercing into Jack's own as if studying the very depths of his soul. "I was born poor. I could never hope to be an officer any other way."
"But you wanted it. You wanted the place in life that was denied to you."
"Yes, sir, I did."
"So you took it?"
"Yes."
"And then you enjoyed living the high life of an officer?"
"No. I went to war." The Maharajah seemed to approve of the reply, and for the first time Jack began to believe he might have a chance of convincing the ruler of Sawad to let them stay.
"So you freely admit you are a charlatan. Must I also assume you are a thief?"
"Yes, sir." Jack felt his eyes drift to a spot 6 inches above the Maharajah's head. It was easier than staring into the man's uncompromising eyes.
"And a deserter?"
"Yes, sir."
"And a coward?"
Jack's gaze snapped downwards. He looked hard into the Maharajah's brown eyes. "No, I've never shirked from a fight." The Maharajah nodded slowly. "I accept your answer." With a lithe bound, he got to his feet and walked to stand in front of Jack. They were of the same height, and the Maharajah came to a halt so close to him that Jack could feel the wash of his breath on his face.
"So, Jack Lark, you are an impostor, a thief, and a deserter. Why have you come to me?"
"Because I had nowhere else to go." The Maharajah threw his head back and laughed.
"Since when did it become known amongst the mighty sahibs that I take in any waif and stray who happens to pass by?"
"I am not an ordinary waif. I came to offer you my service."
"Your Highness."
The finely dressed, fat man had moved forward to stand at his master's side and now chose to intervene.
"He is clearly a spy.
He should be killed and his body thrown from the battlements." He stumbled over the words, obviously ill at ease speaking in English, but there was no mistaking the relish with which he called for Jack to be put to death. The Maharajah never once took his eyes off Jack. "The vizier is quite correct. You are a spy, and I will have you killed." Jack didn't flinch despite the icy flush that hurtled down his spine. "So be it. But that would be a bit of a waste, don't you think?" "A waste? Why would having you killed be a waste?" The Maharajah threw the question back at him, a few flecks of his spittle landing on Jack's face. Such was the force of his words. "Because I may be a thief, and an impostor, and a deserter, come to that. But I was a British officer. I fought the Russians in the Crimea, and I've commanded a company of British soldiers. I would have thought a man in your position could have use of my service." "A man in my position?" The Maharajah seemed genuinely intrigued. "A king who chafes at being under the authority of a foreign power. A man who does everything he can to push against those put in charge of his kingdom, but who stops short of open rebellion for fear of inciting a response stronger than he can bear. A ruler who fears for the future and for the rights of his descendants to rule in his place when he is dead and buried. I think a man like that would want to surround himself with those who know his enemy, men who can help him." "You presume a lot." There was ice in the Maharajah's voice now. "I say what I see. I think you need me." "Need you? I do not need you, and you are wrong, Mr. Lark. I am not afraid." "Perhaps you should be." Jack thought the Maharajah would lash out. His face was full of tension, and Jack was certain he had gone too far. The look of anger passed. "Perhaps I should be." The Maharajah turned on his heel and flopped heavily back into his chair. "Where is Miss Young Summers?" Jack turned and looked over his shoulder. "She is waiting dutifully at the rear end of this room." "So you stole her too?" "She rescued me." The Maharajah arched an eyebrow. "She must be an astonishing woman. I think I will find the time to get to know her better." "I think I shall have to make sure that never happens, sir." The Maharajah gave a short laugh. "I suggest you never try to impersonate a diplomat. You really do not have enough oil on your tongue." "I'll take that as a compliment." For a second time the vizier intervened, impatient with a conversation he could barely understand. "He is a spy. Kill him and his woman. You have wasted enough of your time on him." The Maharajah took no offence at the interruption. It was clear he valued his vizier's opinion. "So, what should I do with you?" "If I truly thought you a spy, I would have you killed this very moment." The Maharajah drummed his fingers on his leg. "Count, what do you think?" The Polish Count did not reply immediately. After a moment's thought, he turned to face Jack. "Did you truly fight in the Crimea?" "I did." "Where exactly?" "At the Alma. I commanded the light company of the King's Royal Fusiliers. We were in the light division and we captured the great redoubt on our own." "Did you kill many Russians?" "Yes." "Were you a hero?" "No. My men were the heroes. I was simply fortunate enough to be with them." The Count turned back to the Maharajah. "That is good enough for me, sire. I believe him." "You believe him because he claims to have killed a few Russian conscripts. He admits he is an impostor. Is he not lying now?" I can see it in his eyes. He has fought in battle. He knows what it is to lead men. I believe him, sire." "The Count hates the Russians," the Maharajah offered the explanation to Jack. "He fought against them back in the 30s, and he would fight against them now if he had half the chance." The Count shrugged. "Of course, sire. We beat them at Stoshek, and I would happily give my life to face them again. Yet I have a feeling I am more likely to have to fight those damn British first." The Maharajah nodded at the wise comment before smiling wolfishly at Jack. "How does that sound, Jack? Are you ready to go to war against your own countrymen?" No. Jack had not even considered the idea. Yet here he was, throwing himself on the mercy of the ruler of a land he knew the British authorities were planning to annex as soon as they got half a chance. If the Maharajah resisted, Jack could well find himself stuck on the wrong side. The Redcoats could become his enemy. "Your honesty is refreshing. Perhaps you are the one who should be afraid," the Maharajah replied evenly. "Do you plan to fight?" "No. No sane man seeks to fight. No father wants his children to go to war. Whatever happens?" The Maharajah's eyes were suddenly moist. "I do not know the answer to that question." He turned to look out of the window that gave a view onto a beautiful courtyard at the very heart of the fortress. "You may stay, Jack Lark, as may Miss Young Summers. You can both stay here in safety." He turned back and fixed Jack with the intense stare that Jack found so unsettling. "But we must both think of the future, of what might be. A man should know what lies in his heart, so that when he must choose, he is ready. For I fear we will both have to choose where our future will take us." He lolled back into his chair and closed his eyes. "Durbar is finished. Count, take Mr. Lark and Miss Young Summers to that Scottish fool who let them in here. Tell him that we have a new recruit for my lancers. He is to find them whatever they need and have this one ready to join us on our hunt tomorrow. He is charged with their safety until then. Now leave me. I have need of rest." The room was filled with sudden bustle and energy as it was quickly cleared of the members of the Maharajah's court. The vizier shot Jack a hate-filled glare as he waddled past. Jack did his best to ignore the hostility that radiated from the pugnacious little man. By rights he should have felt nothing other than elation. After all, he had succeeded in securing a safe place for both himself and Isabel. Yet the Maharajah's words had left him with a nagging sense of unease. The threat of war was suddenly very real. Jack stood back and looked at himself in the long mirror. The sky-blue tunic was cut close, fitting him better than any uniform he had ever owned. Yet it had still not met the exacting standards of the sprightly old tailor whom Subadar Khan had brought to his room, and who had left promising to return later to work on the fit. The white breeches were tight around his thighs, and he had self-consciously assessed the way they clung around his backside. He had no idea what rank the thick white epaulets denoted, but he could not help the prick of vanity that arose unbidden as he studied his new appearance as a lancer in the service of the Maharajah. "You look most fine." Isabel walked into the room, the subtle waft of her perfume preceding her. She too had been able to change her soiled, grimy clothes. The gold sari she wore shimmered in the sunlight that poured through the enormous window overlooking a courtyard with a wonderful marble fountain at its centre. She looked radiant. "You're not so bad yourself." Jack held out his hand, and brought Isabel to his side so they could both look in the mirror at the same time. "It's nice to see you looking like a lady again." Isabel blushed at the compliment. "Thank you. So how does it feel to wear the uniform of the enemy?" She posed the question to Jack's reflection, noticing the grimace it caused on his face. "They are not the enemy. Not yet. But they might be tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after." "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." "But it might, Jack. And what then?" "Then—" Jack looked down at his new, brightly polished riding boots. "Then, I don't know." "You cannot fight against us. That would be wrong." Isabel spoke with the earnest zeal of a young girl. For her, the world was black and white. Despite her desire to escape her father and the suffocating future he had planned for her, it was still unthinkable that she would ever turn traitor. Jack lived in a world of grey and shadows. He did not have her certainty. "Let us hope it does not come to that," he repeated. He let his hand fall to the new sword that hung at his left hip. It was a talwar, the native version of a British cavalry sabre. It hung lower than he was used to, the lower slings of the cavalry scabbard nudging against his thigh. He had been interested to discover that the scabbard was fashioned from leather rather than the metal favoured by the British officers. Subadar Khan had explained that the softer material would lessen damage to the blade. The harsh metal scabbards blunted the edges of the swords they were supposed to protect. Jack was pleased to have been trusted with a weapon, and it felt good to have a sword hanging at his hip once more. "You look lovely, Isabel." He did his best to change the subject. "You could well start a new fashion amongst the ladies of Bundapur. They will all be green with envy the moment they see how fine you look." Isabel turned to one side and admired her profile in the mirror. "Do you truly think this thing suits me? Do you not think it makes me look rather—" She paused as she summoned the courage to address the issue that had concerned her since she had first been wrapped in the folds of the wonderful silk. "Large in the nether regions." Jack laughed at her vanity. "No, Isabel, your nether regions look just fine to me." She brought the fan she held in her hand sharply down on Jack's forearm as he made a great pretence of checking the area of her new attire that had so worried her. He yelped in pain, and the look in his eyes made her laugh aloud. Then he reached for her, and she sank into his arms. Jack held her tight, smelling her perfume, bending his head so that his face was resting against her hair. She was right to question him. The Maharajah had been quite correct. Jack was an impostor, a deserter, and a thief. But was he also a turncoat? He had certainly swapped his scarlet coat for one of blue. But did that make him a traitor? He glanced down and saw Isabel looking back at him. He closed his eyes and leant forward to kiss her for the first time, losing himself in the taste of her lips. Yet a part of him remained detached, even as he felt her body pressing against his. The winds of change had begun to blow. Soon they would stop, and when they did, he would have to decide which way he would turn. Chapter 20. The horse pawed at the ground beneath its feet. Jack could feel its muscles tensing underneath him, a shudder of excitement that left the huge beast trembling. Its jet-black coat was already streaked white with sweat after the first headlong gallop down from the fortress. He had clung on for dear life and somehow managed to remain in the saddle. It was more by luck than any latent ability, and he was relieved to have survived so far. But the day was young, and he was horribly aware that there were plenty more challenges lying ahead. They had left the fortress long before dawn, the Maharajah determined to have the first leg of the hunt completed before the sun had awoken to baste the earth in its stupefying heat. The hunters had gathered in the coolness of early morning, the low murmur of whispered conversation cut short as the first hunting call of the hunting horn, a legacy of the Maharajah's time in England, summoned them to action. A second column had left the fortress shortly after the hunters. 6 elephants, twice as many bullock-pulled carts, and hundreds of servants had been dispatched to construct the resting place where the hunters would shelter through the hottest hours of the day. More guests would arrive for the noon feast before the hunters went back out when the worst of the day's heat had begun to dissipate. Despite her polite request to take part in the day's sport, Isabel had only been given permission to join the secondary party with the rest of the guests. Jack smiled as he recalled her fury at being excluded from the hunt, when he, without half her ability to ride, had been expected to join the other men, who would spend the day enjoying the Maharajah's favourite sport of pig-sticking. Thinking of Isabel led his thoughts to the previous evening. He had been unable to stop the kiss, and it had changed things. Isabel had been his responsibility since the moment they had stolen away from Fenris and the others, but now their growing closeness would complicate his options. He had prided himself on being able to cope alone, with no one to care for but himself. Now he would have to think of them both, a responsibility that was as daunting as preparing to lead men into battle. Jack forced the thoughts of his future away as he contemplated the challenge of the day ahead. He would have to face the trial of keeping pace with the rest of the hunters without any of Isabel's moral support or hasty lectures on how to ride the huge stallion that he had been lent for the day. The bustle of the other riders jostling around him posed as much danger as the wild, careering gallop. His horse's unpredictable movements forced him to make repeated anxious grabs for the edge of the saddle lest he slipped in an ignominious heap to the ground. He felt like a fool. The hunters milling around him rode with dignified ease, languidly taking the refreshments offered by the many servants and syces whilst engaging their fellows in quiet conversation. The looks of pity and disdain on their faces as they gave Jack a wide berth left him in no doubt that his incompetence was obvious to all. The sound of the hunting horn rang out, and the bearers sprang away from the horses, lest they be trampled in the rush. Jack leant forward and grabbed a fistful of his horse's mane as the group of riders started to move out, the next stage in the long ride about to begin. One finely dressed young man looked icily at him, his mouth puckered in distaste, then suddenly pulled on his horse's reins, using the motion to barge Jack's mount in the flank. The sudden jerk caused Jack to cling desperately to the pommel of the saddle. He might not have understood the words, but his ears still picked up the snickers and badly hidden guffaws of his fellow hunters as they relished the foreigner's shaming. There was no time to offer any kind of response for the injury to his pride. The horse lurched into motion beneath him, following the rest of the mounts rather than in response to any urging from its rider. Jack took a firm hold and did his best to grip with his knees as Isabel had told him, determined he would not endure the shame of falling from the saddle. The next stage of the hunt had begun. A dense tangle of foliage stretched as far as Jack could see. Bamboo and forest trees fought to break free from the clinging embrace of the thick, thorny undergrowth, striving to reach for the sky, which was hidden beneath a canopy of matted boughs. The sight of the interwoven greenery was overpowering after so long spent in the rocky high ground, and he savoured the new environment, his eyes roving over the spectacular growth as he tried to take in the wonderful kaleidoscope of colour, teeming with the promise of life. The noise of the jungle was as much of a contrast, the stillness of the mountains replaced by a cacophony of sound. The loud chirrups and clicks of 1,000 types of insect jarred in his ears after so long in the silence of the higher ground. The calls of the brightly coloured birds and the gleeful whoops and shouts of 1,000 monkeys provided a wonderful symphony that only emphasised how alien this new place felt to a man who hailed from the man-made rookeries of London. The heat had built steadily throughout the morning, the humidity in the air now stifling. Jack sweated freely under his tight blue lancer's uniform, and around him the air felt damp. It was an oppressive feeling, and one that was made only worse as they pushed onto a wide trail that led deep into the dark jungle. The sudden, heavy shade pressed down around him and left his eyes struggling to adjust from the bright sunshine. It was a threatening place, and his joy at such vibrant display was replaced with equal measures of unease and discomfort. The slower going at least meant he made it to the next halt without falling off his horse. But the pit of his spine was beginning to hurt, the backache that dogged his life already adding a fresh misery to the day. The sweat had soaked through his shirt, staining the cloth of his new jacket dark blue and leaving him sodden and drained. The other riders seemed as crisp and polished as when they had started, the long, hard ride merely a precursor to the main event, whereas he was already coming close to the end of his powers of endurance. "Sahib?" Within moments of the party coming to a halt, a Sais appeared as if from nowhere to stand patiently at Jack's saddle and offer up a crystal glass full of lemon-flavoured sherbet. Jack took the drink gratefully, drowning it in several huge gulps, careless of the drops of precious liquid that escaped from the corners of his mouth. He wiped the excess from his lips with the sleeve of his coat before reaching for another glass. He was aware of a rider approaching, and he quickly drained the second drink before turning and looking into the smiling face of Count Piotr. The Count removed his square-topped lancer's helmet and used a finger to clean the remains of his own drink from his pencil-thin moustache. "'Tis wonderful, is it not? I've often thought I could make my fortune by having the stuff shipped back home." The cool sherbet had gone some way to revitalising Jack's flagging morale, and he summoned the energy to engage the Count in conversation. "Is Poland hot, then? I'd always imagined it to be cold." He did his best to sit straight in his saddle, ignoring the spasms in his back. "Sometimes it is cold enough to freeze your balls to your saddle." Count Piotr clearly enjoyed his own choice of words. "But I would be happy to drink this nectar whatever the damn weather." His English was accented, but it was clear he spoke the language well. Jack dipped his head in acknowledgement. "You might well be correct." He bent carefully and retrieved a third glass. "It truly is just the ticket." His horse chose that moment to move to one side, and Jack lurched forward, distracted by the conversation, spilling a large amount of the precious liquid onto his breeches. "You are not the horseman, Lark," the Count offered the judgment, a thin, humorous chuckle following Jack's grimace as he struggled to control his wayward mount. "I am not." Jack did his best to wipe away the puddle of liquid from his thigh, but only succeeded in smearing it so that the white of his new breeches was now stained a dirty yellow. "I thought as much. If you stay here long enough, it would be my pleasure to give you some lessons." Jack did not like the Count's choice of words. "If." "The Maharajah gave you leave to stay. I do not believe he specified for how long." "So I've only been given a temporary reprieve. That fat bugger may still get his wish and see me dead." The Count laughed at Jack's lack of civility. "That fat bugger, as you call him, is the Maharajah's most trusted adviser. The vizier is not a man to be crossed. You must tread warily around him. He is as vicious as a cobra and twice as deadly." Jack managed to steady his horse for long enough to accept a fourth glass of the wonderfully refreshing lemon sherbet, warily keeping his free hand ready to make a quick grab for the pommel if the ill-mannered beast attempted to move once more. "He may not have to worry about me after today. I reckon I'll be lucky if I finish this damned hump without falling off and breaking my neck.
I hope not. That would be a sad end for a warrior. A warrior? I don't think I've ever been called that before. You have the eyes. The Count moved his horse without any obvious command, easing it alongside Jack so he could talk more quietly. You have seen war. It is obvious to me, though not, I suspect, to many in the Maharajah's court. He looked around, suddenly furtive. When he spoke again, it was in a hoarse whisper, pitched so quietly that Jack could barely hear his words. You will have to watch your back. This place is a damned viper's nest. I have been here 6 long years, and I have seen men poisoned, murdered, and executed in 1,000 foul ways. It is not a safe place, Jack. Not for you, not even for me, not for anyone. Jack took a careful look at his recently drained glass. Poisoned, you say? The Count roared with laughter at Jack's anxious expression and clapped him hard on the arm. Enjoy the hunt, Jack Lark. Jack tossed the heaving crystal glass back to the waiting Seiss, the cold liquid he had so avidly consumed suddenly heavy in his stomach. The Count's warning had made a mockery of his relief at having secured a refuge in the Maharajah's court. Despite the intense heat, he shivered, as if someone had just walked across his grave. The lead shikari crashed his elephant through the undergrowth. His team of beaters thrashed and shouted around him, their long line spread wide as they sought to drive the precious boars towards the gathering of mounted hunters. Their enthusiastic din reached Jack where he sat uneasily on his horse. His hands gripped and re-gripped the thick bamboo spear he had been given when the hunters had been organised into their heats, the small groups that would be allocated a boar by the umpires who ran the hunt. Nerves fluttered in his belly, the sour taste of fear mixed with the pungent sherbet to produce a noxious cocktail that made him feel quite sick. Count Piotr had given him a rapid run-through of the rules of the hunt. The garbled instructions had been confusing, to say the least, and Jack still had only a vague understanding of what was supposed to happen. The word and judgment of the umpires was final. When the boars, driven forward by the shikari and his men, thundered out from the thick undergrowth, it was the umpire's duty to verify that the beasts were big enough to be hunted. Only the largest would be selected and allocated to the heats. It would then be up to the riders, or spears as the Count had styled them, to ride down the enraged animals, charging through the jungle until they could close and thrust their vicious weapons into the boar's flesh. The Count had explained a long list of other rules, though his advice on not crossing riding lines and impeding the other riders had made little sense to Jack, who knew it would be a miracle if he managed to stay on his horse long enough to even see the animal he was supposed to chase. He did his best not to fidget as he waited with the other 3 spears of his heat. Thousands of small insects had appeared and seemed determined to feast on his flesh or to wallow in the moisture in his nose, mouth, and eyes. He passed most of the long wait flapping his hand around his head in an ineffectual attempt to avoid breathing in or accidentally consuming dozens of the irritating and persistent plague. The other riders ignored the foreigner in their midst, their quiet conversation conducted in their own language. Occasionally they would look in his direction, their guarded eyes and veiled gestures making it clear that he was the subject of their discussion. One of the spears was the same thin-faced noble who had deliberately tried to unseat Jack earlier in the day. He was clearly the leader of the group, the other pair careful to laugh loudly at his remarks, their obsequious behaviour revealing the younger man's status as eloquently as any badge of rank. The thin-faced young man caught Jack's eye. There was no trace of humour in his deep brown eyes, no sense of shared camaraderie. There was simply disdain and dislike. Englishman. His English was flawless as he called for Jack's attention. Jack did his best to seem unfazed at being suddenly addressed in his own language, sitting as calmly and confidently as his poor posture would allow. "You stink!"
The comment brought about a peal of laughter from the young man's cronies, as if it were the funniest thing they had ever heard. The thin-faced noble smiled with smug satisfaction, turning his horse around scornfully. Jack ignored the barb. The boy could not have been older than 15 or 16, the age when image meant everything. He himself could well remember the urge to impress.
"Swar a rehen!"
He heard the voice of the umpire shout out the warning to the heat to prepare to begin their chase. It was the phrase Count Pyotr had told Jack to listen for. He had translated it as, "The pigs are coming." It was time to hunt. The horse's hooves drummed hard into the muddy floor of the jungle, thick clods of earth flung up into Jack's face as he clung on for dear life. The motion of the horse pitched him around wildly as it galloped through the thick grasses, twisting this way and that with a speed that he could not hope to control. He had given the animal its head and let it choose its own way through the dense foliage, sensing it was his only chance of keeping pace with the other riders. Twice he had nearly been decapitated by a low branch, and his fine blue lancer's coat was snagged and torn by the dozens of wait-a-bit thorn bushes that flew past before he even became aware of their presence. Despite his best efforts, the other spears had quickly left him behind, outstripping him within moments of the umpire sending them after an enormous boar that was at least the size of a table. Jack had caught a glimpse of the mighty animal as it thundered past in a blur, a snatched glance at its wickedly sharp tusks and flared nostrils making him doubt the wisdom of trying to tackle the beast with nothing other than an unfamiliar spear. He could hear the animal up ahead as it crashed through the scrub, but after that first brief glimpse he had seen nothing more than a fleeting shadow. His fellow riders flew after the beast, their loud shouts and whoops of delight spurring each other on. They rode hard, bent low over their saddles, all deference forgotten now the race was on. He could only marvel at their horsemanship as they charged through the jungle, twisting and leaping through the matted branches and dense undergrowth. He felt quite the old man as he brought up the rear, the distance between him and the rest of the heat opening quickly and widening steadily despite his best efforts to keep up. He jabbed his spurs hard into his horse's flanks, a flare of annoyance at being left behind goading him on. The horse bounded forward, the raking pain in its sides pushing it to greater speed, its hooves drumming into the ground in a fast staccato. The sudden increase in pace caught Jack unawares. His spear fell from his grasp as he clutched desperately at the saddle, his balance thrown by the violent pitch and fall. He never saw the low-lying bough that jutted from a tangled patch of bamboo stretching across his path. The collision was sudden and violent, the speed of the horse driving Jack's body into the hardened limb with a sickening crunch. The impact snapped his jaws together, the sound echoing loudly in his head as he was catapulted backwards. He had the briefest sensation of flying through the air before he smacked into the ground, all breath driven from his body. He lay motionless, the pain flaring white-hot across his vision. He had hit the branch with his right arm, and now it felt as if he had surely broken the bone. He tried to sit up, but the pain was too intense, so he simply lay where he had fallen, staring up at the thick canopy above his head, the bright sunlight flickering down through the few gaps in the highest branches of the tall trees. Carefully he reached across with his left hand, anxiously touching his damaged right arm, feeling for the grate and the agony of a broken bone. The pain caused him to curse aloud, but to his relief he found nothing that indicated anything worse than bad bruising. "Sahib?" Jack looked up and saw a smiling brown face staring down at him, the young boy making a valiant attempt at subduing a fit of the giggles. "Sahib, shall I send for the doctor?" Jack forced himself to sit up. The motion made him feel sick. He twisted his head and vomited into the undergrowth, spewing up a liberal amount of the lemon sherbet he had consumed. guts emptied, he spat out a thick wad of phlegm before wiping his face on the sleeve of his blue lancer's coat, careless of the dark stain he streaked across it. "Help me up!" he snarled at the young boy, removing the smirk from the youngster's face in an instant. As he staggered to his feet, Jack heard a roar of victory from deep in the jungle. He might have fallen at the first hurdle, but it seemed his fellow spears had been more successful. His first taste of pig-sticking was over, his only reward a near-broken arm and dented pride. He nodded to the young groom and started on the long walk to the midday meal. He would have a few precious hours to rest and recuperate until the cooler air of the afternoon allowed the pig-sticking to resume. The hunt was set to continue until late into the evening, and he knew he would have to find the strength to rejoin the chase, the notion of giving in quite unthinkable. His ragged, stubborn pride would force him to ride again. Chapter 21. "Goodness me, Jack, you look truly terrible. Should I presume you fell?" "Presume what you damn well please." Jack was in no mood for Isabel's teasing. He had followed the young syce to an enormous canvas pavilion that had been erected in a large clearing in the jungle. His horse had been recaptured, but he had no intention of getting back in the saddle until the pain in his right arm had subsided to a more bearable level. He had stalked into the midst of the gathering, glaring at anyone who caught his eye and doing his best to ignore the looks of amusement and sneers of condescension sent his way. He had found Isabel reclining on a chaise longue that looked as if it had been imported from the finest salon in Paris. She clearly felt comfortable in these luxurious surroundings. She had been deep in conversation with the young girl, who had made a hasty exit as soon as she saw Jack approaching. He caught a glimpse of a strikingly beautiful face and a slim, lithe figure wrapped in a white silk sari before she disappeared into the crowd that thronged inside the open-sided pavilion. Despite his exhaustion, he felt his interest rise, and he made a note to ask Isabel who she was. Had he not been in such a foul humour, he would have been impressed by the Maharajah's thoughtful organisation. His servants had transformed the barren grassland into an oasis for the tired and sweaty riders. Huge fans covered the inside of the pavilion's roof, with teams of pankawallahs seated around its edge, pulling on the thick cords that swept enormous squares of fabric back and forth to create a wonderful breeze within the tent. All four sides had been left open, with thin gauze draped artfully to hide the dozens of sturdy wooden poles that supported the heavy frame. Inside, the pavilion was a place of refinement and comfort. The servants had arranged a whole palace's worth of furniture, an eclectic mix of chairs, sofas, tables and loungers brought into the depths of the jungle to allow the riders to sit or eat in any way they wished. Beautiful Persian rugs covered the floor, their fine, intricate weave carelessly trodden under the muddy boots of the riders, their delicate beauty sacrificed in the name of temporary elegance. One corner of the pavilion was clearly reserved for the Maharajah and his personal guests, the most dignified personages entertained in a splendour Jack doubted existed in many English country houses, let alone in the middle of a jungle. Elegant crystal and fine bone china had been brought, along with enough food and drink to serve 1,000 guests, and everywhere he looked, patient servants waited to offer the riders any refreshment they desired. My poor Jack. Isabel held her hand in front of her face to hide her smile. She could see the stains and the muck encrusted on Jack's new uniform, and from his growled reply to her greeting she could tell he was in no mood to be teased. You must have had a simply awful morning. Let me get you some of this delightful lemon sherbet. It really is quite revitalising. It's just what you need. No, thank you. I do not have the taste for it. Jack waved away Isabel's offering. He had no desire for more of the pungent lemon liquid. He waved at another waiter and took a brandy and soda, using the bitter liquid to scour his mouth of the sour taste of vomit. It is astonishing how quickly one becomes accustomed to so many servants. Isabel made the remark as she scanned the room. The servants outnumbered the guests several times over, most simply standing impassively around the edge of the pavilion like so many bronze statues, waiting to answer any whim or command. Her thoughtful comment hit the mark. Jack had barely stopped to consider his action. He had wanted a peg, so he had casually flicked his hand to get one. It was a sobering thought, and he wondered quite when he had begun to take the presence of so many servants for granted. "Who was the girl?" He asked the question, trying to sound uninterested. "Oh, you noticed her, did you?" Isabel pouted as she replied. "Only vaguely. I was pleased to see that you had begun to make some acquaintances here." "So the fact that she is stunningly beautiful passed you by? You are a terrible liar, Jack." "Come on, Izzy, I barely saw her." Jack protested his innocence. It was the first time he had used a shorter version of her name, and it brought a smile to her face just as he had hoped it would. It spoke of the growing intimacy between them, and it mellowed her mood. "Her name is Lakshmi." She reached out and put her hand on Jack's thigh, pulling him closer so that she could rest her head on his shoulder. "Pretty name?" "She was named after the ruler of Yanzi." "So she has a name fit for a princess?" "Well, that is jolly handy, because she is a princess herself." "Truly?" "She is the Maharajah's daughter." Jack sounded impressed, despite his attempt at appearing indifferent. "Indeed she is. She told me that he has only 2 surviving children that he acknowledges. Their poor mother died giving birth to her brother, the Maharajah's son and heir." "His supposed heir. Did Proudfoot ever discuss that with you or your father?" Isabel lifted her head from where she had rested it against him. "No? What do you mean?" Jack leant in so that he could speak in a whisper. "Proudfoot told me that he would never acknowledge the Maharajah's son as his true heir. He's intent on annexation." Isabel gasped, earning her a glare of disapproval from Jack. Fortunately, few people were paying any heed to the pair of white-faced strangers, and he continued quietly, "He will apply Dalhousie's doctrine here. When the Maharaja dies, the kingdom of Sawad will become part of the British Empire. At least, that is Proudfoot's plan." "It is preposterous. How can we dictate that his son is—" Isabel blushed before she spoke the next word. "Illegitimate. Keep your voice down. I don't think we're safe here." Her concern was immediate. "Why do you not think we're safe?" "I was speaking to Count Piotr. It appears this court is a dangerous place. We'll need to be careful." Isabel rallied well. "Of course. Especially if what you say is true. If Major Proudfoot is truly intent on annexing the Maharaja's kingdom, then we will have to make sure we escape before it happens. Oh, goodness, that man. He thinks he can dictate to a king. He has more ambition than I thought." "Of course. He's political. They relish this sort of thing." "However unfair it may be." Isabel looked genuinely flustered as she absorbed the news. Whether her reaction was caused by the potential threat to her life or the unfairness of Proudfoot's ambition, Jack was not sure. "It's foreign policy." He reached across and took Isabel's hand to reassure her. It looked small in his, her pale skin against his tanned flesh. "I doubt fairness is high up on their list of priorities." "But what of the boy? He will be cheated of his inheritance." "I'm sure the authorities will allow him to stay on and keep his title, provided he keeps quiet and does not stir up any trouble, of course. But all power and authority will pass to the governor. There will be no more of this halfway house of pretense and folly. Perhaps Proudfoot is correct. Perhaps it is better that we rule here. Better for whom? Isabel's whisper was icy. She withdrew her hand as her anger flared. Surely not better for the prince. Better for the people, perhaps. Jack was thinking aloud. He had not given much attention to the politics of British rule in India. He had arrived thinking only of commanding a company of redcoats. He was a soldier, not a politician, and the more he saw of the machinations of state, the less he liked them. We will build hospitals, roads, schools, universities even. The people will be better cared for under our laws and with all the benefits we can give them. Isabel became quiet as she listened to Jack's arguments. Yes, perhaps that is better. It just feels wrong. Is it wrong to want what's best for people, even if they don't know it themselves? You sound like a parent. A mocking tone had returned to Isabel's voice. Do I? Jack seemed appalled at the idea. Perhaps I'm getting old, I don't know. I just want to be a soldier, an officer if possible. Only if you can keep finding people to impersonate. Despite her best intentions, Isabel could not resist teasing him a little. Oh, it's not a perfect plan, I know that. Jack became sombre as her comment made him think of his past. But it's all I have now. Not all, Jack. Isabel reached forwards and took both his hands in her own. You have me. A gentle round of applause and the scraping of chairs being pushed back prevented Jack from replying. Around the pavilion, people were getting to their feet, leaving the important business of eating and drinking to one side for a moment as they welcomed the Maharajah into their midst. You are here again, Englishman. We thought you would have had enough of crawling around on the ground for one day. The same young rider who had insulted Jack that morning greeted his arrival back with his fellow spears with a sneer of disdain. I'm pleased to be here. Jack's voice was icy. He knew he should not let the youngster's insults irk him so, but he could not help responding. He found himself wondering how the boy would fare if he was ever thrown into battle. He would like to see how long his arrogance lasted under fire. We do not want you. Go back to the women and wait for the men to return. The boy's two cronies laughed on cue, clearly understanding the insult. Jack stayed silent, but continued to look the group's proud leader straight in the eye. If he hoped to win a battle of wills or to gain a grudging respect, he was to be disappointed. The haughty young noble pulled hard on the reins of his horse, bringing it around in a tight circle as evidence of his superiority over Jack as a rider, as if any were needed. He spoke loudly in his own tongue, the sharp laughter that inevitably followed making it clear that Jack was the butt of yet another barbed comment, albeit this time one he could not understand. Jack took firm hold of his new bamboo spear. This time, he promised himself, he would not fail to at least remain seated. He had endured enough laughter and scorn for one day. The jungle rushed past just as before, yet Jack was beginning to feel his senses coming to life, so that he was not completely overwhelmed by the experience. He no longer flinched from hazards. Instead, he kept his head up and tried to read the terrain ahead, adjusting his weight and his balance to naturally counter his horse's movements as it thrashed along at a terrific rate. He could see the shadow of the boar in front of him, its huge, powerful body ripping through the thick undergrowth. His fellow riders were ahead of him, but this time only by a few lengths. His heavy bamboo spear was held tightly in his hand, his knuckles showing white as he grasped it in a vice-like grip. He was determined he would not suffer the shame of losing a second weapon. The boar was twisting and turning as it charged headlong through the jungle, its loud snorts coming in fast rushes as it sought to escape the dreadful pursuit. Jack was close enough to catch an occasional glimpse of its heavy body, and every sight sent a primeval rush through his veins. He thrilled with the urge to hunt, the excitement of the wild ride spiced by sparks of fear every time he narrowly avoided another painful collision. The young noble was in the lead, his horse moving with a lithe freedom as it bounded after its prey. The boy raked his spurs back hard, summoning a final surge from his willing mount, the hunt rushing to its conclusion. Jack saw his arm tense as he pulled back his spear, keeping the dreadful weapon still and level in a casual demonstration of exquisite skill. With a final loud yell, he thrust the spear forward, ramming the wickedly sharp point into the boar's body with such force that the bamboo shaft splintered into matchwood. The point ripped through the boar's tough hide, taking the beast just behind the shoulder, the spear embedded deep in its flesh. The boar grunted as the weapon was driven home, its legs still trying to power it forward despite the dreadful blow that sent it spinning to one side. The other riders flashed past, each man hauling on his reins to bring his mount around, their cries and shouts loud as they raced to turn back without colliding with one another. Jack pulled on his own reins, ignoring the bright flash of pain in his arm. Somehow he managed to bring his horse to a halt, its body already bending to make the turn. As the rearmost rider, he now had the advantage. He spurred hard, forcing his mount forward so that he led the charge back towards the wounded boar. His mind was racing. He remembered the Count's warning that a wounded boar was a dangerous adversary. He had spotted the wickedly sharp tusks on the brute's head as they had raced past, and needed no one to tell him the damage they could do to anyone foolish enough to venture into their range. Yet still, he charged back the way he had come, risking his life in a childish attempt to prove his courage after the shame of the morning's failure. He yelled at his mount, urging it on, desperate to stay ahead of his fellow spears. He heard the roar of the wounded animal before he saw it, a deep, guttural shriek of pain and anger. He could see the patch of undergrowth where the boar had gone down, a dense tangle of thorny bush covered thickly with vines. He braced his arm, readying it to strike, aiming to bring his horse directly past the matted bushes so that he could thrust his spear down and take the wounded animal from the side as he rushed by. A shadowy figure flashed past his left-hand side, followed quickly by another. Jack had the sense of movement all around him, dark outlines erupting from the undergrowth on both sides. All thoughts of the wounded pig disappeared in a heartbeat as the first screams rang out. The cries of men launched to the attack, echoing around him. Chapter 22. A figure burst out of the bush to Jack's left. He was dressed in a filthy robe that might once have been white, but was now torn and stained to a muddy grey. Yet the flash of his tulwar was bright as he rushed forward, his mouth open wide in a war cry. Jack twisted in the saddle, yanking on the reins as he tried to turn to face the sudden threat. The ambusher was on him the moment his horse slowed. There was no time to react, and he could only watch in horror as the bandit raised his weapon. The talwar slashed forward, the blade flashing once in a beam of sunlight before it thumped into the neck of Jack's horse. The beast screamed in agony as the weapon ripped through its flesh, blood gushing from the dreadful wound. The stricken animal pumped its legs, still trying to obey its rider's commands. Yet it was too badly wounded. Its forelegs buckled, its strength failing fast. Jack pushed against the saddle as he felt the horse going down, kicking the poor beast mercilessly as he struggled to get free. For one dreadful moment his boot stuck in a stirrup, but he ripped it out and threw himself to one side, thumping painfully into the muddy ground. In an instant he had scrambled to his feet, ignoring the flash of agony that followed the jarring impact, knowing he had only moments before he would have to fight for his life. As soon as he found his footing, he brought the heavy shaft of his pig-sticking spear across his body, his hands locked like claws into the thick wood. He had barely a moment to plant his feet onto the slippery ground before the ambusher was on him. The tulwar slashed forward, a controlled swipe at Jack's neck that he parried with the shaft of his spear. The bandit leered as he attacked again, his mouth twisted with hate. The blows came fast now, attack following attack with such speed that Jack was denied any chance to counter. His bamboo spear hacked and splintered as he was forced to block blow after blow. He was being driven steadily backwards, forced to give ground as the bandit came at him relentlessly. Somehow he kept his composure, an eerie calm descending on him as he fought. He read his opponent's intentions in his eyes, and each time he was able to place the thick shaft of his spear in the right place to counter the vicious blows. He defended patiently, waiting for the chance to strike back. The bandit's foot came down on a patch of sodden earth layered with a slimy crust of brown mould. It took him no more than a heartbeat to feel himself beginning to slip, but it gave Jack the opening he had been waiting for. The instant he realised what had happened, he whipped the spear around so the point was at his assailant's stomach, then stamped his foot forward, just as he had been taught in 100 training sessions on the grey, damp training grounds of England, using the spear as an improvised bayonet and musket. An explosive grunt was torn from his mouth as he thrust the sharp point into the bandit's stomach. The heavy spear was designed to pierce the tough hide of a wild boar, and it punched into the man's body with ease. He tore the spearhead free from the wound and thrust again, mercilessly hammering it past the man's hands, which were desperately trying to wave it away. The tip tore through the man's throat, ripping a grotesque hole in his neck, the sudden eruption of blood bright red against the backdrop of matted jungle. Jack felt no shame at his vicious assault. There was no time for remorse now that the ambush had been sprung. As the first bandit dropped to the ground, he was already turning to find where the rest of the shadowy figures had gone. The sounds of combat came from no more than a dozen yards away, but the dense undergrowth prevented Jack from having a clear view of exactly who was fighting whom. He had no idea who had come to attack the hunters, but he did not care. There would be time for understanding later. Without a backward glance, he charged towards the noise. It was time to see how the arrogant young man was faring against an opponent who fought back. The shouts of anger and confusion grew louder as Jack ran. The thick swathe of jungle masked some of the sounds, the dense vegetation muffling even the harsh noise of combat. It made it unlikely that any of the other groups of hunters would be able to hear the fight. Jack knew then that he and his 3 fellow spears were on their own. As he burst from the undergrowth, he realised that a desperate struggle was taking place. 2 of the riders were still in the saddle. Their horses reared and plunged as a press of bodies circled around them, looking for an opportunity to attack. The 3rd horse was down, and Jack could see nothing of the rider beneath the hacking talwars of 3 bandits. A dozen bandits were attacking the 3 horsemen, each as filthy and dishevelled as the one Jack had already struck down. Only one wore black robes. Jack felt nothing of the madness that had erupted from the blackest depths of his being at the Alma. In its place was coldness, his rational mind holding sway against the insanity of battle. He tasted the bitter tang of fear, the gut-churning horror that he could be about to die. Yet still he threw himself forward without hesitation, gambling on violence and speed to overwhelm the attackers. He leapt over a fallen log and rammed his heavy spear into the back of one of the bandits circling the riders. A thin mail coat over heavy blue robes protected the man, but the vicious spear punched through it as if it was silk. The force of the attack drove the spear clean through the man's body, the tip erupting in a gory explosion from his stomach, his anguished howl of horror the last sound he would ever make. Jack was drawing his new talwar even before the man had hit the ground, abandoning the heavy spear now that it was inextricably embedded in the man's body. The bandits' heads whirled around at the unexpected assault from the darkness of the jungle, their eyes showing white under their tightly bound pagdis. His second target had no longer than a single heartbeat to glimpse his attacker. It was time enough for his mouth to gape open in shock before Jack's talwar slashed across his neck, ripping out his throat. The proud young nobleman roared as Jack flew into the bandits like a berserker of old. The boy was brave, fighting hard. He spurred his horse forward, using the confusion that Jack's attack had caused to thrust his spear down into the breast of one of his assailants. His companion was not so lucky. The black-robed tiger sensed his men's fear at the sudden assault and pushed himself to the fore, striding into the vicious battle. His heavy talwar drove forward, cleaving the closest rider's spear in two, the raw power of the assault unstoppable. The terrified hunter dropped the ruined weapon and reached for his own talwar, but the tiger was simply too fast. Recovering his sword from the blow, he brought it around in a glittering arc above his head before smashing it across the mounted hunter's breast. The talwar drove deep, tearing a wide gouge that gushed forth a torrent of blood. The man toppled silently from the saddle, two of the bandits pouncing before he had stopped moving, driving their own blades into his dying body. Jack fought on, slashing his sword forward, only to scream in frustration as his next victim turned in time and parried the blow, driving both blades wide. Jack ignored the wild defence and stamped forward into the opening, slamming his head forward so it crashed viciously into his opponent's face. The bandit crumpled, his nose pulped, the blood smothering the hands that he clutched to his battered face. Jack was merciless, and he immediately thrust his sword down, piercing the man's body as it fell, driving the tip through his back and into his heart. A shriek of horror came from Jack's right, and he twisted on the spot, his latest victim already forgotten. The young man who had thought nothing of insulting the white-faced stranger had finally been thrown from his horse, the brave beast succumbing at last to the dozen wounds it had taken. The youngster hit the ground, his sword knocked from his grasp as he crunched with bone-jarring force onto the jungle floor. Two bandits came at him the moment he fell, their teeth bared in delight, like a pair of wolves going for the kill, their swords thirsting to be buried in his flesh. All trace of the boy's arrogance was gone. His face was ashen with fear as he looked up and saw the bandits charging towards him, death in their wild eyes, and he screamed in horror, his terror bright in the darkness of the jungle. Jack threw himself at the boy's attackers, no time for anything other than a wild charge. Leaping over the body of the first man he had slain, he lowered his shoulder and hit one of the men with a force that knocked him sprawling to the floor. The impact nearly threw Jack off his feet, and he stumbled, lurching to one side, fighting to stay upright. It saved his life. The second bandit had a moment to react to Jack's sudden arrival, and he used it to redirect his blow, turning his blade in mid-air so that it sliced across Jack's path. The blade keened as it stung the air before scoring a thin line across his fine new uniform coat, missing his stomach by no more than half an inch. Had he not slipped, he would have been sliced in two. Jack threw himself forward despite the flash of fear as he saw the blade whisper past his stomach, and crashed into the man who so nearly killed him, knocking him violently to the ground. He felt the man's body underneath his own, and immediately drove his elbow down, smashing it into the bandit's windpipe. It was a vicious blow, the kind so common in the gutter fights he had been brought up with, and it crushed the bandit's throat, choking him. There was no time for pity. Jack sensed movement behind him and pushed himself to his knees, using the choking bandit's body for leverage. By some miracle he had managed to keep a firm grip on his talwar, and he slashed the blade around his waist, using its momentum to bring him face to face with the new threat. The talwar rang with a violent impact that jarred Jack's already battered sword arm. His instinct had saved him. As he spun around on his knees, He saw that he had driven his sword into the side of the bandit he had knocked to the floor. The man had quickly scrambled to his feet, thinking to bury his own sword in Jack's unprotected back. Instead, he had been cut down, his intended victim turning with an astonishing speed. Jack saw the man's shock before he fell face first to the ground, his body giving a single violent shudder before it lay still. Jack hurt. The twin collisions sent waves of pain scoring through his veins. Stabbing his talwar down into the ground, he forced himself to his feet. As he rose, he saw the look of astonishment on the young nobleman's face, terror alive in his wide-eyed stare. There was no time to spare the young man a word. Jack hauled the astonished boy upright. He might be young, but Jack would need all the help he could muster if he were to bring them both out alive. For the fight was far from over. Jack had fought hard and saved one of his fellow spears from death, but he had spied the man in the black robes, and he now knew who was attacking them. If he were to somehow save them both, he would have to face the man who had already bested him once in combat. He would have to face the tiger. Chapter 23. Get ready, boy. Jack spat a wad of phlegm to one side as he growled the words. Let's see if you can fight as well as you can talk. He saw the boy swallow hard, his Adam's apple bobbing up and down as he pushed down his fear. The youngster raised his tulwar. He held the blade low, ready to rip out the guts of the first man to charge him, handling the sword with obvious familiarity. Someone had trained him well. Jack nodded in encouragement as he saw the boy's weight move to the balls of his feet as he found his balance. His talwar was a thing of beauty, its long blade decorated with a fine tracery of swirling lines so that it seemed to pulse with life as the sun caught it. It was a fabulous weapon, the kind only the very wealthy could afford. The surviving bandits faced the two hunters with obvious confidence. There was no haste in their movements, no sign of panic, despite the sight of so many of their brethren struck to the ground. At their centre, the black-robed leader walked calmly to the fore, bringing his enormous two-handed sword round as he readied himself to fight. He cannot be killed. The boy whispered the words, his voice cracking as he recognized the bandit leader. Bollocks. Jack spat out the word. The pause in the fight was starting to stretch his nerves. He is the tiger. He's a prince of the darkness. He cannot be killed. The boy sounded close to panic. Jack quickly counted off the bandits. The black-robed leader had 5 men left, less than half the number he had been able to command when he unleashed the ambush, but still too many for Jack to fight on his own. He looked across at the boy. He could see the youngster's terror, the point of his sword beginning to twitch as the fear took hold of him. He would not be able to fight. Fuck it! Jack screamed the words, trying to summon the madness he knew he needed. He took a deliberate pace forward, lifting one blood-stained hand so that it pointed straight at the tiger. You! He shouted the word, jabbing his finger so there could be no doubt who he was addressing. You black-robed arsehole! Just you and me. He stalked forward, his talwar hanging casually at his side. The madness he craved stayed stubbornly distant, but there was something in the sheer folly of what he was trying to do that was intoxicating. Just me and you. You understand? He lifted his talwar, taking a firm two-handed grip on the handle as he saw the black-robed man raise his hand and gesture for his men to hold. That's it, you bastard. Jack's heart hammered in his chest. His fear flared bright, the foolishness of his actions screaming through his mind. Yet even as his emotions started to burn, a part of his mind remained calculated and calm, planning the fight he was summoning, seeking a path to victory despite the violent emotions that stirred in his soul. He looked into the pitiless black eyes of the tiger, and he felt his confidence wane. He remembered the intensity of the bandit leader's attack, the speed of his sword and the dreadful power of his blows. He could feel fear beginning to win the battle for his soul, the madness he craved swamped by the icy rush of terror that was surging up from the pit of his belly. "That's it. Just you and me." The words calmed him, his own voice reassuring. The tiger kept coming, his men obeying his command to hang back. "Time to dance, you bastard!" Jack screamed the words aloud and threw himself forward. He would have to banish his fear. This time he would not submit. He would kill the man who could not be killed. Or he would die. Jack's talwar scythed through the air. He kept the movement controlled, his muscles already braced for the tiger's parry. The blades came together, the noise of metal grinding on metal loud in the enclosed space in which they fought. Jack recovered his blade just as he planned, twisting his wrist before slashing his sword backhanded, battering it against the huge talwar that flicked out to meet it. Again and again the two men slashed and parried, their swords glittering in the dappled sunlight as they flashed back and forth. Jack fought with restraint, concentrating on his speed, never once trying to land a telling blow but flowing through the impacts, trying to find a gap in the tiger's defence. He grunted as the tiger parried, the huge sword meeting every attack, the man matching his speed with ease. He could see the smile behind the mass of beard that covered so much of his enemy's face, the black eyes that gleamed with perverse enjoyment, as if the two men were contestants in a hard-fought sport rather than deadly foes fighting for their lives. Jack took a half-step back, pretending to give ground. The tiger came after him in a heartbeat, the talwar slashing hard at his guts. But Jack had planned the feint, and he twisted past the fast-moving blade, driving off his heel and stabbing his own talwar forward with a lightning-quick jab. He yelled as he felt the tip of his sword tear into the black-robed man's flesh, the sweet roar of victory surging through him. But the tiger was fast, quicker than any man Jack had ever fought. Before Jack could thrust his full weight behind the blow, the bandit leader brought his sword back in a frantic parry. The wild blow knocked Jack's talwar aside, the sharpened tip only able to score a deep gouge across the tiger's front, rather than the killing blow Jack had hoped for. The tantalizing glimpse of blood flecking the tip of his sword gave Jack hope. But the tiger recovered quickly from the momentary lapse. His great sword rose to deflect Jack's next riposte before driving forward and forcing him to parry quickly lest he be caught himself. Now the tiger began to chant. His deep, melodic voice clear despite the animal grunts as the two men kept up the pace of the fight. It was just as Jack remembered, the rhythmic resonance of the words sending a shiver down his spine. There was no pause in the bandit leader's attack as he chanted. Indeed, he began to push Jack backwards with a series of blows even faster than before. Jack parried one after another, his arms beginning to feel like lead as the onslaught continued. Again and again the tiger attacked, the blows ringing down. Jack's defence began to falter. And twice the tiger nearly had him, the tip of the talwar whispering past, his weakening parries only just doing enough to deflect the merciless assault. The tiger bellowed the last word of the chant, his voice rising in a crescendo loud enough to wake the dead. His sword flashed past Jack's face, a final mighty sweep of the blade before he lifted it above his head, readying the killing blow, one Jack had seen before. He dived forward, hitting the ground with his shoulder. He sensed the tiger's sword scything down, the dreadful edge reaching for him, the heavy talwar cutting through the air where he had just been standing. He scrabbled on the ground, twisting around in the matted undergrowth before driving his boot forward and smashing the heavy heel into the huge man's groin. The tiger grunted in pain, but his sword continued its descent, hunting for its prey. The blade cut into the undergrowth, missing Jack by no more than an inch, and stuck fast in the spongy ground. Jack rolled away and stabbed his own talwar upwards. It had been badly battered, but the point was still sharp, and it punched into the tiger's body, tearing through flesh and gristle as Jack drove it deep. Blood ran down the blade, washing over his wrist and arm and falling to stain the front of his blue uniform coat, yet still he twisted it, tearing the life from his foe. With the blade still buried deep in his body, the black-robed bandit leader toppled to one side. He made no sound as he fell, his huge sword dropping to the ground as his nerveless hands lost their strength. Jack scrambled to his feet, never once taking his eyes off the huge man he had just defeated, unable to comprehend that he had won. With their leader struck down, the bandits fled into the jungle, running for their lives despite the fact that Jack was battered and exhausted. At that moment, a washerwoman with a kitchen knife could have defeated him, but the bandits clawed at each other in their haste to get away, the jungle hiding them from view as they scattered in every direction. Jack walked to stand over the body of the black-robed tiger. He looked down at the face of the man who could not be killed. He did not see a prince of the darkness, nor did he see a man who had been feared and hated in equal measure. He simply saw the lonely face of someone moments from death. The tiger's eyes were open, the vitality of life still alive in the blackness. They moved as Jack stood beside him, fixing him with a hard, flat stare of hatred. The tiger's lips began to move. At first the words were barely audible, but from deep in his soul he found the strength to speak louder. As he did so, he kept his eyes fixed on Jack. The words flowed from him, their pace and tone steady, with the same deep melodic rhythm that had so unsettled Jack when they fought. Jack sensed the presence of the nobleman he had saved. The youngster came to look down at the man who had so terrified him. "He is cursing you." The boy spoke in no more than a whisper, his fear still very real. Jack felt a shiver run down his spine as he met the tiger's merciless stare, the terror he had kept contained for so long once more writhing deep in his belly. "What does he say?" He spoke firmly, wrestling with his emotions as if they were a demon to be fought and imprisoned. He felt the calmness begin to return as he regained control, the fear forced to the recesses of his mind, committed to the darkness in his soul. "He is condemning you to a life without hope, a life alone." The boy's voice trembled as he told Jack the meaning of the foreign words, translating them with reverence and no trace of vindictive pleasure. The tiger stopped abruptly. Jack never once let his eyes move from the bandit's unwavering stare, and he saw the glimmer of life flicker, then leave the pitiless black eyes forever. The man who could not be killed was dead. The crowd jostled around him. Jack felt his exhaustion build, his body craving rest. The bewildering hubbub continued unabated. Shouts and questions bellowed back and forth in the language of the Maharajah's court that Jack did not understand. The young noble he had saved stood at the centre of the melee, surrounded by a crowd of men who were all talking at once. Jack recognised the urgency of their words, the hurried interrogation of people desperate to find out what had happened so they could either claim some share in the victory or steer well clear of the blame. The young noble's higher-pitched tones cut through the deeper voices of the men who challenged him, carrying an authority that silenced them. He spoke quickly and firmly, and the crowd pressed forward as they listened to his hurried account, captivated by the drama. Jack wanted no part of the inquest. He had done what he had felt to be his duty. Now that the vicious fight was over, he wanted nothing more than to fade back into the background. The Maharajah and his entourage arrived, the ruler's huge white stallion flecked with mud and sweat. It had clearly been ridden hard to get here. Jack saw the distress on the Maharajah's face, the strained expression of someone seeking news they knew could change their life forever. The entrance of the king silenced the throng that had gathered at the sight of the ambush. With an athletic bound, the ruler of Sawad leapt from the saddle and rushed towards the young noble who now owed his life to the white-faced foreigner he had treated with such disdain. Without stopping, the Maharajah reached forward and crushed the boy to his chest, enveloping him in a fierce embrace, the bright prick of tears in his eyes. Finally, Jack realised who the youngster was, and why his comrades had been so ready to laugh loudly at his quips. Jack had just done the British government a great disservice. He had saved the life of the Maharajah's heir. "There are no words to convey my thanks, Jack." Jack could not meet the Maharajah's intense stare. He looked to his boots, but the Maharajah reached forward, lifting Jack's hands and enclosing them in both of his own. The touch was intimate, the Maharajah's hands warm and the feel of his flesh shocking. Jack felt intensely uncomfortable at the contact, his natural reaction to withdraw, but the Maharajah held him firm. "You saved my son. I am in your debt." "I did what had to be done, sir." Jack's reaction was stilted. "You English! You're so bloody stuck up!" The Maharajah dropped Jack's hands, smiling at the obvious relief on his face. "I thank you anyway. Whatever you say, I owe you a great deal. My son has told me what happened here." He turned and looked at the dead bandits that his men were dragging unceremoniously into a grotesque heap. "You certainly do know how to fight." "I'm a redcoat. It's what we're trained to do." "My son says he has never seen anyone quicker." The Maharajah's voice was full of admiration. "You killed that black-robed bastard. For that alone I owe you a reward." "I do not ask for one, sir. You have already shown me favour by allowing me to stay in your court." "One of the best bloody decisions I ever made." He turned and gestured for his son to come to him. "I am forgetting my manners. I suspect you have not been properly introduced. Jack, this is my son, Abhishek. He will rule after I am dead and gone, thanks now to you." Jack looked the boy in the eye. The earlier childlike arrogance was gone. Abhishek's privileged background had been no protection from the brutal reality that so many boys his age would already have experienced. Jack hoped the bitter knowledge would teach him well. "Thank you." The boy's voice was small, the moment clearly embarrassing him. But he was also the Raj Kumar, and he pulled himself upright, standing with a stiff back in front of the man he had insulted so cruelly but who had saved his life. "You have done our country a great service." The Maharajah whooped with delight at his son's pomposity. "You see, Jack, I have bred a fine boy. He has the grace of a king. He is not like me at all." Jack inclined his head to acknowledge the boy's thanks. "It was my pleasure to be of service, sir. I can only hope that my disgusting stench no longer offends you as once it did." He could not resist the barbed comment. The boy might have been a prince, but that would not stop Jack twisting his tail. Abhishek's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He glanced across at his father before bowing his head. The Maharajah clapped his hands with enjoyment. "You are priceless, Jack, absolutely bloody priceless. Now then, let us speak of your reward. "Sir, there is no need for a ward." The Maharajah flapped his hands to silence Jack's protest.
"Enough of your bloody English modesty. I wish for you to become my adviser."
Jack laughed at the notion. "Sir, you most certainly do not need my advice."
"That is my decision, not yours. You will also assume command of my lancers. As of this moment, you are my general."
Jack shook his head in denial. The promotion was meteoric indeed, but the idea that he could be a general was laughable. "I cannot accept, sir. As your son here will attest, I cannot even ride a horse properly."
"I will not be gainsaid, not even by a hero. Abhishek will teach you to ride. It can be his punishment for not treating one of my guests with the right amount of courtesy."
The Maharajah was clearly delighted by the idea. "Now, we must leave this place." His face twisted with distaste as he surveyed the scene where his son had come so close to death. Jack stood back as the Maharajah left. Like most ambitious men, he had come to India to seek his fortune. He had never dreamt it would lead him here. It might only be in the service of a willful Maharajah, but Jack had been made a general. It was quite a step up for an urchin from the East End of London.